Hello, hello everybody. I shall do the customary wait to see that everyone can actually hear me, because that is a thing that is occasionally a problem. Observe the chat, observe the chat. Excellent. Right. So, welcome everybody to 8 o'clock on UK evening. And as usual, it is the Patreon Drydock live section, so we'll be going through some of the alternate history, etc. questions from Patreon, the Patreon thread this month first, and then we will be going through questions from the chat. I'm glad the audio is working. I did actually replace the audio cable recently, so hopefully you should be noticing a slight pickup in overall audio quality in the most recent videos and videos going further on, because as it turns out, despite the fact that a Blue Yeti is a relatively expensive microphone, the cable it comes with is just a standard USB cable, so I replaced it with a shielded USB audio cable, which seems to have a slight effect. And yeah, before anyone says anything, yes, I do know I need a haircut, but if you'd had the week I've had so far, you wouldn't have had time for such niceties either. Now, as I can see from the earlier chat before I went live, yes, I know what's happening in Ukraine. No, we are not going to be talking about it. As I've said before, this channel is a history channel. It covers up to 1950. We're here to talk about naval history and that kind of thing. We're not here to talk about modern politics. We're not here to talk about modern conflicts. And yeah, that is basically that. You know, we don't discuss the Gulf Wars. We don't discuss that kind of thing. So we're not going to talk about the current conflict either. Emotions will just run too high. You know, I've know people who are currently stuck in the mess that's going on. I know a lot more people who have family members who are stuck in that mess that's going on, and I know people who are on the other side of things over in Russia who, for various reasons, are not being particularly well treated by the Russian government and haven't been for quite a while. So, you know, it's not that I don't have a stake in this, but this isn't the time or place. And also, to be perfectly honest, as I've said, well, I don't think I've actually said in any Drydock or anything so far, but one of the things I absolutely find fascinating is the persistent belief that people have of looking to celebrities or YouTubers or people like that for opinions on current world events. And I was looking at it and I'm sorry, but especially when it comes to actors, I know this is a bit of a digression, but when it comes to actors, why do you want to know what an actor says about any kind of modern political, social, etc. event? Their entire skill set is to pretend to be something they're not and say things that they don't actually believe in, and get paid lots of money for it. So why would you ever believe anything an actor says about what they believe? They're literally, you know, if you want to be uncharitable, their entire skill set is very effective lying. So, yeah, that's that's a slightly weird thing for me, but there you go. Anyway, digressions aside, and actually, just while we're here, before we kick off with the questions, my only exception to the rule of nothing past 1950, as some of you will probably be aware from the video with Captain Sequest about USS Iowa, is if I'm talking to a veteran who actually served in the Navy during a particular time period, then obviously I will let them speak their piece if they're happy to come and talk on the channel, because then that's what they're saying about their service. It's nothing to do with me or me making any representations one way or the other about a topic. So yeah, that's basically that. And yeah, the only thing I'll say other than that is, Chris Campbell, what do you think it will accomplish? You know, if we derail this entire live stream into talking about the current world events, what is it going to accomplish? It's not going to help anyone in Ukraine. It's not going to stop any Russians. It's just going to make us all angry and upset. You know, there are plenty of places, if you want to go and talk about that kind of thing, that aren't here. And yeah, the only thing I'll say in parting is, and this applies to anything that comes out of this entire situation, is be smart about what you're looking at. Don't believe things just because you want to. Don't end up acting like Japanese Navy propaganda. Just, you know, engage brain. Now, on with the show. I've had quite enough of that. Mark Griffiths asks, can you provide details on your references used for the naval logistics and how to build a Navy video? Yes, I can, but if you're watching this or listening to this, be either before or after the fact, for those particular videos, which is why it's in this section, please email me or DM me, because one of the things with the naval logistics and how to build a Navy videos is that, shockingly enough, there aren't actually that many books about those subjects. So you can't really point to, like I normally do, anything from 3 to a dozen books and go, right, these are the ones you need to look at. It's the kind of thing that you have to build up by going through loads and loads of books and articles and things over a long period of time. For example, some of D.K. Brown's excellent series will talk about stuff such as, you know, the difficulties in extending dry docks, and why the Royal Navy had to limit the size of some of its ships, not based on what the biggest docks it had in the UK were, but what the biggest docks they had available in places like Gibraltar and Malta were. So that's an element of logistics and building a navy. And then you can look at something like, say, the French battleships. I think it's French battleships of World War II. It could be French battleships. Anyway, there's a John Roberts book that covers the Richelieus, the Dunkirks, etc. Now, in that, you get an insight into the problems that the French had with the logistics and infrastructure when it came to building the Richelieus, and actually the Dunkirks for that matter. So that gives you another facet of it, and so on and so on and so forth. And you build up these little snippets of information, like Norman Friedman's US Battleships talks quite extensively about the issues with fueling the US Navy, both when it was coal and oil fired. And eventually you'll put all these things together. So I can give quite an extensive list of references that will give you the little snippets. And there are, to be fair, there are a few books that cover aspects of these kind of things in more detail. There's a book sitting up in the library upstairs which is all about coal and coal supply in the 70 odd years that was relevant for major navies. So I can also give you those kind of books, but you know, it's all over the place. Anyway, so hopefully Mark Griffiths will see this in one way, shape or form. Check's question. Congratulations, you completed a 1 to 350 Mikasa. I hope you've got somewhere decent enough to display and store it, because 1 to 350 models tend to be fairly substantial. And yes, I feel your pain with the photo etch. Photo etch guardrails are quite possibly the bane of anybody's existence if you want things nice and neat. I have yet to discover any way of clipping off extensive amounts of photo etch guardrail without it looking like it's been through the wars, which, to be honest, is fine for me. I don't mind my models looking like they've been through about 16 different storms, but I understand some people want like the nice, neat stuff. Robert Sokal asks a similar question. Can you please recommend a good book or article about the cause and process of British naval decline after World War II? So there's a couple which give you a fairly good insight into that. So there's Rebuilding the Royal Navy, a warship designed since 1945 by D.K. Brown. This is kind of he has a series before the Ironclad, Warrior to Dreadnought, the Grand Fleet, Nelson to Vanguard, and that's the block I usually recommend because that covers the period that the channel covers. And the stuff that I'm interested in. But then rebuilding the Royal Navy warship design since 1945 for the time period that it covers, because obviously it doesn't go all the way up to the modern period, it goes up to roughly the Falklands. That covers obviously the period going from the Royal Navy being, at that point at the end of 45, the second largest navy in the world, down to the size it was approximately around the time of the Falklands. It's obviously mostly talking about warship design, but as with his previous books, talks in extensive detail about what the budget restrictions were and why they were having to make these kind of design choices. So definitely something to look at. The other one, which is a little bit more tangential, but actually still gives a fairly good insight through the lens of one particular aspect of the Royal Navy, is David Hobbs's The British Carrier Strike Fleet After 1945. As the name suggests, it's looking in almost entirely at the carrier fleet, but obviously that drops off in size quite dramatically from 1945 through the cancellation of CVA-01. So there's definitely a lot to look into there. I don't think I've seen any books specifically about the decline of the Royal Navy that I could recommend offhand. There may well be a couple of good ones out there, but if there are, I haven't read them yet. Peter Guy asks a fascinating, if slightly morbid question. It says, about a year ago, Battleship New Jersey channel, which is a very good channel, paid a visit to Battleship Cove, where they showed a room on USS Massachusetts dedicated to sailors who had social diseases, as the Turian ambassador would say. Was returning to duty from shore leave with these unwanted guests a punishable action? Or did they simply show an educational film and hope the boys behaved in port? Was it treated differently during wartime? Presumably you can't have 100 men under guard during general quarters even on a battleship. Or was it simply if you came back from port every time you went straight to see the ship's doctor, and then they said no more shore leave for you? So, yeah, if you've contracted diseases from staying at a cheap house of ladies of leisure, shall we say, or something along those lines, it's not something I've looked into in any great detail for rather obvious, hopefully understandable reasons, but from what I'm given to understand, a lot of it would come down to whether or not it affected your duty and whether or not it affected the men around you. If you had something that was inconvenient and horrible for you, but you could still go around and do your duty and it didn't threaten the well-being of the rest of your crewmates, that was kind of, well, that you're a bit of an idiot, aren't you? Anyway, get back to work. If it took you offline from duty, if it was sort of debilitating enough, that was more serious, because then you have, through your own stupidity, rendered yourself incapable of fulfilling the job they pay you for. And kind of the midline between that is if you've contracted something that you don't want spreading to the rest of the crew and is transmissible in some way, shape or form. So that's why you have the on the subships you have the famous red lined toilet, which is for people to use if they have these kind of transmissible things, so that they can't transmit it by surface to surface contact with other people. That's not good. You might get written up on or some kind of disciplinary for it, because you're putting everyone into an inconvenience. But in those circumstances, usually you can still do your duty, just with slight accommodations. But then no navy likes making specific accommodations for individuals. You're supposed to all act and work the same. So yeah, it's one of those things. Dr. Clark in the chat, hello, by the way, is linking a fairly good JSTOR article on venereal disease, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd have to say. It's one of those things. Randy Topeka asks, with regards to your opinion on the role of an Issei-type battle carrier, you mentioned there's no really good roles for it in frontline combat. How would it have suited the US Navy in the role of shore bombardment and ground support? Given the fact you see both standard battleships and escort carriers taking part in these roles, it seems that a converted standard class battle carrier would give you the best of both worlds, and the extended battleship effectiveness past the range of the main guns without the fragility of an escort carrier. Thoughts? Well, I don't think I don't think that there is a role for the battle carrier in that respect, because the thing is, if you're, as I've said when I talked about the ESA conversions, the only real definable niche role for it happens in a circumstance where the very fact that that niche exists means things have gone horribly, horribly wrong already. If you're in doing something like the US Navy's doing, where it can spare battleships for prolonged shore bombardment, you already have the resources to build things that can do those individual jobs better, which would be, using the old battleships and escort carriers in combination, because a converted standard battle carrier, so let's say you took a Colorado, stripped off the 2 aft turrets and made a kind of, Issei style hangar deck on the back, is not going to carry as many aircraft as a escort carrier. It's not going to be able to operate quite as well as an escort carrier. It's not going to be able to maintain them as well. It's going to do a worse job than an escort carrier, with the sole exception of being slightly more survivable in terms of kamikazes. And you've also halved its firepower for shore bombardment purposes. Plus, of course, you've now stuck a massive, great box full of flammables and explosives on the back, thus diminishing its ability to survive in the face of kamikaze attacks. So, you might as well just have an escort carrier and a standard battleship instead, because a combination battle carrier doesn't do either job particularly well, and the only thing that you'd really want from a standard battleship when it comes to that kind of job would be spotting and reconnaissance, and you already carry float planes for that purpose, so you can do that element. And you don't need a handful of strike aircraft. If you've got a battle carrier that's got 2 or 3 Avengers or Vindicators or Dauntlesses or whatever on it, and maybe 3 or 4 Hellcats, all that's offering you is a very small ability to blow up a very small amount of real estate, assuming your enemy has absolutely nothing they can use to oppose you. Because the minute they've got anything even approaching even just a handful of anti-aircraft guns, you could be losing significant percentages of your entire air wing to one lucky burst of 25mm AA fire. IO2 clarifying that would it be more useful if you had a decent set of helicopters? Maybe then as an anti-submarine warfare thing, but yeah, that's not a role that exists in World War II. And to be honest, by the time you get to the 1950s, again, yes, you could use a battle carrier as an anti-sub platform, but then why not use an escort carrier or a small fleet carrier instead? You'll get a lot more helicopters on it. You can't usually shoot submarines with your battleship main guns. Kaz Talon asked to compare the US Navy's 14-inch guns to the British 14-inch guns. Which system, in your opinion, was the better of the two? Despite the Royal Navy not using the system on their own ships until and then exclusively on the King George V's versus the US Navy having the majority of the standards with them installed, both navies seem to have extensively developed the weapons, even though the use of said weapon system within the respective navies was rather one-sided. I mean, it's a bit of an unfair comparison, to be honest, because the US Navy's 14-inch guns are World War I era weapons, albeit that they were refitted and upgraded to new mods in the interwar period. And that the fact that they are World War I weapons does come with a number of caveats about, they were cutting-edge design, heavy guns at the time, whereas by the time of the King George V, the 16 and 18-inch guns are the cutting edge. So not only do you end up with, obviously you're talking about technology that's 10, 15, 20 years further advanced when you're looking at the British 14-inch, but you're also looking at issues like, when the US is trying to fit a dozen 14-inch guns onto a standard battleship, which is considerably smaller than a King George V. On a few of them, they end up parking the guns too close together and they get a lot of interference and thus inaccuracy, which they then have to mitigate against with various measures, including, delay firing coils and stuff like that. So when the British are designing the King George V, because all of that has happened to both the US and other nations, they have that body of experience to draw on, and they don't make that mistake. But then to make a direct one-on-one comparison, it would be unfair to say, oh yeah, well, the Americans made this mistake and the British didn't. And the British didn't make that mistake in part because the Americans did. About the only thing that you could really say fairly as a direct comparison between the two, I think, would probably be in terms of absolute accuracy of the gun, in which case the British gun does have a slight advantage. Again, with Bill Duran's article in Warship International recently, Warship International, and some of the tables that he produced there, it shows that actually when the gun was fired, it was actually a supremely accurate weapon, the British 14-inch. And the only reason I'd say you can make that comparison against the American 14 inches from World War One is because the second most accurate weapon was the British 15-inch 42, which is contemporaneous with the American 14-inch gun. So having a very, very accurate weapon is not something that is necessarily improved by it just being later. That is a matter of just pure good gun and shell design. But that's really about the only comparison you can make. It's not like once they'd fixed the issues with the mountings, it wasn't like the US 14-inch guns were inaccurate. They were pretty solid and pretty good. They just weren't superbly accurate to the level that the King George V 14 inches were. HMS Inadvisable asks, Douglas Rieman's book HMS Saracen deals with hazing culture and physical beatings amongst the midshipmen and junior officers under the neglect of senior officers in a World War I era Royal Navy monitor. His World War II books, and he served in the Royal Navy from 1940, do not mention any beatings at all, and bullying seems more actively and heavily discouraged. This leads to my question. When exactly did bullying and beatings become recognised as a problem amongst senior Royal Navy officers? See, this is a thing I've never really come across. I'm not, as I've said before in a few other videos, I'm not particularly au fait with the detailed social side of naval history when it comes to, interpersonal relationships within the crews, unless it notably affects combat effectiveness one way or another. Personally, I would be very, very surprised if this was the kind of behaviour you described in a World War I era monitor was widespread in the fleet. I've certainly never come across any indication that it was widespread in the fleet. I could well believe that there was a problem ship where this happened, but to be honest, even for a World War I era Royal Navy ship to have significant amounts of beatings and dangerous hazing type behaviour would be very unusual. It's not the kind of thing the Royal Navy would tolerate in any real way, shape or form. So, yeah. I say I haven't read the books, but, if you look back to the Age of Sail, physical discipline was one of the more extreme measures that the officers had to keep order amongst the men. So if there's constant beatings, etc., going on between the men or between the junior officers, that apart from anything, that dilutes the power of what they can hold over you, and also, possibly makes people unfit to fulfill their duties the next day. So they would very definitely discourage it then. And since conditions, generally speaking, in the Royal Navy improve from the Age of Sail onwards, I can't see why there'd be any particular lapse between then and later on. Chloe Sinclair asks, before I ask about USS Atlanta, my favourite ship, what design features could have been dracked up to help it live through its first major engagement with the enemy? Well, unfortunately, given the amount of damage Atlanta sustained from its own side, the single most effective protection it could have got would probably have been a tennis court-sized US Navy battle ensign with a couple of searchlights pointing at it so that San Francisco stops shooting it. Yeah. The problem is it's just a very, very small vessel, and there's not a lot that you can really do about improving it. I mean, the poor things were already, by the sort of mid-war period, having stuff hauled off of them so that they wouldn't topple over with all the additional weight that was having to be put on them in terms of lightweight anti-aircraft weaponry, radar, etc., etc. And realistically, given the shells that actually put paid to Atlanta from both sides, you're not going to be able to armour the thing against those kinds of things. So, yeah, in terms of design features, there's not a huge amount that can be done at that point. To be honest, the best thing that Atlanta could have done to help it live through its first major engagement with the enemy is to be somewhere else. Yeah, that's about it. That's about the best you can do, unfortunately, for poor old Atlanta. And by somewhere else, that basically means not in the line of fire of San Francisco. Duke of Petchington asks, I ask if the Royal Navy had not started the 4.5-inch gun development program, but was still developing the 5.25-inch gun, how would this affect the historical ships which were originally armed with the 4.5, and would the Royal Navy iron out any issues with the 5.25 and their mounting? So back in the early 1930s, and this is actually quite ironic because there's another question in the recorded section of the Drydock, which if you can hear a slight hum in the background, that's because my computer is currently rendering that for upload later tonight. Apologies to those of you who are expecting the release earlier today, but it's been, as I say, one heck of a week. Now, back at the beginning of the 1930s, there was the Royal Navy was looking at what kind of gun should they have for anti-aircraft use, but dual-purpose use. And they looked at the 4-inch, and they considered that the 4-inch would make a decent anti-aircraft weapon. Indeed, they already had 4-inch AA guns, but it was too light for anti-surface use. The 5.25 would come on a bit later when they were looking, obviously, at battleship armament with a very heavy emphasis towards stopping destroyers, and the secondary being towards the anti-air, whereas this was an earlier program that was looking more at the anti-air, but with obviously wanting to stop things on the surface. One of the other things that they're working on, or they were working on, is a 4.7. So they were trying to get a 4.7-inch weapon in there, dual-purpose one. They were thinking about sticking it on the Nelsons, but when they looked at it, they thought the 4.7 was actually a bit too heavy a gun to get a AA first secondary weapon, dual-purpose weapon up. And they ended up dialing that down to the 4.5, which is how you got the 4.5 on Ark Royal and other British carriers and the refits, so Renown, not Warspite, but Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. So if they didn't go with a 4.5-inch, then that basically reverts it one step back to trying to work out a true high-angle mount for the 4.7, which would probably end up being quite heavy. You're not therefore probably going to get to as many of them on the refits, etc., as you could historically. You maybe get 8 pairs of 4.7s instead of 10. But the carriers, Ark Royal and the Illustriouses, etc., probably will still have exactly the same number of AA guns, so 2 twin mounts on each corner, effectively. They'll just be the slightly heavier 4.7s instead of the slightly lighter weight 2.5s. The interesting thing is going to be come mid-late war, when they're looking to put true deep dual-purpose guns on various destroyers. that's going to be quite interesting, because the 4.5 as installed in the battles and darings, as I'm sure Dr. Clark in the chat will commiserate with, the 4.5-inch mountings were quite heavy. So if they're having to work with a long barrel 4.7, which is even heavier still, that could have some very interesting implications on the battle and daring design histories, either minimizing the number of guns that they have even further, or making them even larger ships than they were historically. Mason, if Bismarck had not been intercepted and Raeder had a chance to put his proposed task force tactics for attacking convoys into action, how effective would the attacks have been, and how would the Royal Navy have responded? So this references some of the original plans that for Operation Rheinebogen that were made, and ideally they want Tirpitz available, or Tirpitz? I don't know, whatever. But about halfway through the directive, they're kind of like, yeah, okay, but that would be ideal, but that's not really going to happen. Their next idea was to have Bismarck and Prince Eugen head out, which is what they historically did, but they were hoping that Gneisenau would have repairs completed and would depart into the Atlantic from Brest, and then Gneisenau should join up with Bismarck and Prince Eugen, at which point the point of Bismarck would be to distract and draw off the heavy escorts, thus allowing Gneisenau and Prince Eugen to savage the convoys, and then when Prince Eugen, being the shorter range vessel, had to head off for home, then it would be Bismarck and Gneisenau basically doing bait and switches with Bismarck hitting the convoy escorts, drawing them away, and then letting the smaller battleship head in and deal with the actual convoy ships themselves. Although they do acknowledge at the end that until Tirpitz is operational, even that particular task force they don't have that much hopes for if the Royal Navy puts together what they describe as some heavily escorted convoys. So it's one of those things where they had some very interesting ideas about what they were going to do, but of course they ended up with Gneisenau and Scharnhorst being almost consistently being damaged by Royal Air Force and Fleet Air Arm efforts in Brest, and you ended up with what we got historically. I am catching the super chats, by the way. I'm recording them, but for answering later, but obviously I'm going through the Patreon stuff first. How the Royal Navy would have responded to that, by the way, if Bismarck and Prince Eugen had broken out through the Denmark Strait and Gneisenau had come out to fight, then I suspect they probably would have drawn in ships that they didn't draw in otherwise. For example, Renown was sitting just over the horizon when Bismarck was going down for its final battle with Ark Royal. They were keeping it back because they had King George V and Rodney there, and they knew Renown obviously isn't as well protected as them. But if Gneisenau had been there, then I almost certainly would have brought Renown in to deal with that, whilst the two battleships dealt with Bismarck. Brian Smith, excuse me. Brian Smith asks, if the Philippines are giving independence in 1940 instead of when planned, do you think this changes American plans for the Pacific theatre? Would the US get involved if only the Philippines are attacked after they've got independence and the Japanese don't attack Pearl Harbor? Would it change American plans for the Pacific theatre? Not really, because the old war plan Orange idea of going over and basing out of the Philippines was already long dead and buried by 1940-41. But in terms of would the US get involved, yes, they still would, purely because, as I've mentioned in a few other questions, if the Japanese take the Philippines and they're heading south to the Dutch East Indies, at that point, it's not so much about whether or not you are, whether or not they've attacked US assets directly. It's the fact that the US boot on the throat of the Japanese war effort, the oil, is about to be removed. And if the US wants Japan to stop doing what it's doing and establishing a hegemon in the Western Pacific, they have to go to war at that point before Japan fully exploits the Dutch oil. Otherwise, I mean, yes, sure, they can still build up and go after Japan later, but it's going to get a progressively harder and harder task because Japan will have more and more of what it needs from the Western Pacific region under its control. Shazix asks, on their way to the Battle of the Denmark Strait, HMS Hood is duplicated and its copy is transferred to the modern time with a full crew right next to HMS Prince of Wales, the aircraft carrier. How do both crews react, and would the Hood duplicate end up as a new museum ship in the UK? I think both crews would be very, very surprised. Hood's crew, because the Queen Elizabeth class, believe it or not, are actually the first ships in the Royal Navy that are bigger than Hood was. So Hood's crew would be like, oh, we're not the biggest anymore. This is a sad day. Also wondering how the heck they've wound up back at, well, depending on exactly when this year, but let's say they end up back at Portsmouth. Otherwise, they'd be very confused winding up at wherever Prince of Wales might be at the moment. In the middle of, where are they? I don't know, middle of the North Sea, something like that. Anyway, would the Hood duplicate end up as a museum ship in the UK? Yes. Yeah, pretty much. What exactly to do with the time-displaced crew would be an interesting issue, but especially if Hood just pops up in Portsmouth. It's literally right next to the Portsmouth Dockyard, the National Museum of the Royal Navy. About the only problem would be finding somewhere to put it in all of that. They might have to shift it over to Gosport, just across the water. But, yeah, I mean, if you've got a mostly intact working Hood in 2022, it's obviously going to become a museum ship. I don't think the public would stand for anything else. Pendon Harley asks, this evening you may pack whatever books or documents you wish to bring with you for tomorrow. You are being sent to the Britain in the year 1790. You'll have letters of introduction from powerful patrons to any Drydock, ironworks or other industrial operation. The letters will state you're an eccentric inventor of considerable talent. Where do you go and what do you attempt to do to help prepare the Royal Navy for the war that's to come? I would go to Woolwich. I'd go to Woolwich Arsenal. I'd say hello to my grandmother's great-great-great-great-grandfather, which will probably leave him very confused. And then I would probably... The books and documents I would take with me would probably consist of, given the industrial capabilities of England at the time, Britain, it would be a series of sketches and documents and drawings charting the Simmons and Seppings reforms from the early 1800s, because that will allow me to kickstart the building of much larger, much stronger sailing warships that can carry much heavier guns, and also use up a lot of short timber, which is quite good. The other things I would take with me would probably be the designs for the earliest explosive shells, because they use gunpowder and iron, which, you know, that's already a thing that exists in the 1790s. So inventing a basic gunpowder base fuse is not going to be that difficult. So effectively, I've invented shell guns that can fire shells into a wooden warship, whereupon they will explode, which will obviously be a lot more lethal than simple round shot. That's, I mean, to be honest, that's probably going to be all I need to do, because the Royal Navy is already well on the way to coppering the ships. They already know about that. There's not really a lot I can do in terms of masts and rigging at that stage in industrial development, but just with those two things that I've given them, I would have given them the secrets to effectively building 120, 130 or even 140 gun ships of the line, armed with what counts as, in that period, armour-piercing explosive shells, which, you know, if you thought the Battle of Sinop was a one-sided curb stomp, just wait till you see what happens at the Trafalgar Mark II. Schufels, which is a name I rather like, asks, okay, it's a very long one. Do you have any good reference sources for ships, armour and gun layouts for the time, which is the early 1870s? Any good sources on naval gun penetration values for the era, and good sources for photo line drawings of the same era ships? Photos, yeah, I have quite a few myself, so feel free to drop me a line on that. Line drawings and so forth, Oscar Park's British battleships and Ballard's The Black Battle Fleet would be very good sources for that if you don't want to go to the archives, and the archives will have, in the National Archives at Kew, etc., will have a fair number of those plans if you want them in extreme detail. But, you know, Park's and Ballard's books both will have armour and gun layouts for that period as well, obviously for the British. Park's also includes a number of foreign designs, French designs, and then you can go from there, because there are a few other books that will cover the foreign ships as well, although finding books on French ironclads is actually surprisingly difficult in any great detail. So, yeah, I'd say start with The Black Battle Fleet by Ballard and Oscar Park's British battleships, and then work your way up from there, because they'll either have some drawings of the other foreign ships, or they'll reference books where you can find it. Salamin Shikia 93 asks a question Dr. Clark will be quite happy with. I'm a bit curious about how the what if 28 knot QEs with small tube boilers instead of historical large tube boilers can translate that extra power into extra speed. Would it do so with the same hull form, screws, turbine sets, etc. as they did historically, or just have the screws turn faster, possibly causing cavitation? Or would changes be made such as modified screws, different direct drive turbines, geared turbines, etc., and would they be significantly more expensive than originally? And if so, would there be an HMS Malaya in this class? They wouldn't be too much more expensive. The technology already existed. I mean, the small tube boilers were a little bit new and experimental, so there might have been a slight cost increase, but that's not going to be enough to significantly change the layout of the ships. Given that Jellicoe, when he wanted to do it, he wasn't persuaded from not doing it on cost grounds. He was persuaded into not doing it by the shipyards because they thought it would be a bit too difficult for them. Which is a very different factor of things. Yeah, they would need slightly modified screws because they're dealing with a different power output and a different rates of rotation. But exactly what type of design of propeller you use, etc. These are all things that are factored in the design process when you know how much horsepower you're putting through. But the hull form, turbine sets, etc. are going to be broadly the same. So it wouldn't be a huge amount of change, to be perfectly honest. Colin Williams. Admiral Lee commits an act of open insubordination against Halsey and heads south with whatever ships he can rally to his flag. This is for the Battle of Samar. Either to calls for aid from Taffy 3 or at a time of your choosing. I'd like him to appear after Taffy 3 has been engaged, so part way through the journey north when he's still begging Halsey to let him go back. Whose career survives? Is Lee court-martialed for his insubordination even if he wins? How much does the outcome of the battle influence his fate? And how does Halsey factor into all of this? Will the Navy bend over backward to protect his image? So whether or not Lee wins is going to be a huge influence on this. You rarely have to ask permission if you've won, and if you lose, you basically already lost the court case before you step inside. But I mean, if Lee loses, then obviously they're going to throw the book at him. He was an insubordinate to Halsey. He's taken his ships off. He's lost the US a bunch of fast battleships. And he's given the Japanese a huge victory on a platter, and it didn't accomplish anything, apart from maybe inflicting a bit more damage on ships that were probably already going to be sunk anyway, or at least deterred. So yeah, if he loses, it's very bad for him. If he survives, it's a much... if he survives and wins, which is by far the more likely outcome, then it's a much more interesting factor, because Lee is then a hero, and it's much, much, much harder it's incredibly difficult to censure somebody who's just delivered the US its greatest battleship versus battleship victory in history. And given, I think, there's also the underlying thing of, if Lee hadn't been there, obviously we know how the Battle of Samar turned out with Taffy 3 and escorts managing to see off Kurita, but no reasonable person in 1944 is going to assume that's what would have happened. So everyone in 1944 is going to be, and 1945 is going to be going, Lee has saved the Task Force 3 and the landings from being chewed up by Kurita's battleships and cruisers. If he hadn't done this, then they would have all died. So people may be out for Halsey's blood at that point for risking this disaster happening that was only averted by Lee, which then brings it back into the realms of PR, because one of the reasons the US Navy didn't censor Halsey after 2 hurricanes, or 2 typhoons, was to maintain morale. Halsey also isn't really going to want his name dragged through the mud, and there is a little bit of a get-out clause, because, of course, Halsey was asked to leave Task Force 34 in place. He was then asked to send Lee back a few times, and he was asked, where is Task Force 34? So I suspect that even if internally the US Navy might not believe it, the front that they might come up with for public consumption might be along the lines of... it might be something along the lines of, yes, Admiral Halsey always intended to have Task Force 34 blocking the Straits, and for unknown confusion of communication administrative reasons, it wasn't immediately put into place, but luckily Admiral Lee remembered Halsey's orders, or Halsey's statement that Task Force 34 would be there, so he went off to do it. He showed initiative, he saved the fleet, technically he was following orders, so nobody gets court-martialed. The end. That's basically, I think, what they would have done, even if internally Lee might have got a very, very, very minor rap on the wrist for technically violating orders. As I say, nobody's really going to end up going after him for that if he's walking away with such a smashing victory. Sorry if I'm rubbing my eyes a bit. It has been, as I say, a very long day and a very long week, and as a result, I'm a little bit tired. Where were we? Right. Just very quickly addressing SPR Ninja's question. It said, you said the Hood was larger than anything till HMS Queen Elizabeth. Didn't Vanguard displace more than 52,000 tons at full load? It did, but Vanguard was also almost 50 feet shorter than Hood. So when I say Hood was larger than anything till Queen Elizabeth, I'm talking about length. The Queen Elizabeths are the first ships that are longer still than Hood. And if I just double check, HMS Queen Elizabeth... Yeah, the Queen Elizabeth class are 920 feet long, so they're about 60 foot longer than Hood. Whereas Vanguard, as I say, was almost as much below that. Yeah, I'm not going to bed yet. I will, but I'm not yet. Oh, thank you, Mrs. Strack. Ooh, water bite. Top tip, if you're ever doing medieval reenactment, at least in the tent where you can get away with being slightly ahistorical, water wipes are the best. Refreshing, cleansing, all sorts of things. Right, I now feel a bit more awake. CK asks, it's 2/22/22. Well, it was a few days ago when this question was asked, and the UN has decided, of all things, that in an effort to get the general population of the world excited about naval history, they give you unprecedented access to their archives for the next 22 years, and access to any ship or submarine currently mothballed, still in use, to use in a Great White Fleet-esque voyage around the world, drumming up support and interest for naval history, along with giving you basically a blank check to achieve your goal. Jumping on the bandwagon, various historical societies and naval museums have all offered you the use of their vessels as well. Shipyards have reached out about doing the necessary repairs to make any ship seaworthy. What ships do you pick for the core of your fleet? And once again, this assumes that money is no object. Major damage, missing engines will be repaired. Although you can't just take a random piece of hull plating and build a complete new ship around it. You can access any vessel that's either a museum ship or floating somewhere in reserve. Crewing won't be a problem. Okay, core. So let's define that as half a dozen ships. So if I'm taking half a dozen ships around the world to drum up interest in naval history, I would take... I'm going to take Victory, get HMS Victory out there in the water, get USS Constitution out there in the water. Since it's currently a museum ship, I'd take Midway as, apart from anything, as a support vessel. Helicopters, etc. can land on her deck. So that's 3 out of 6. What else can I bring up? I mean, you can't really repair Vasa to get moving, but considering she's like 40% polyethylene glycol by weight, which is a bit of a shame. What else could we do? So we've got our carrier, we've got 2 Age of Sail ships. Ideally at that point, the other 3, I'd want a battleship of some description, something big and impressive. And let's face it, the only place that has preserved battleships is the States. So let's grab New Jersey. Then Ryan can come along. So let's take New Jersey out, and then the last 2 should be ironclads, I think. Because we're not going to get anything yet older than that for the Age of Sail. So let's take Warrior, beginning of the Ironclad era. And then, what should we have for the latter part of the Ironclad - pre-Dreadnought era? I'm not going to excavate Mikasa because there's not really much of Mikasa as she was historically left. Late era ironclads. Yeah, there's not a lot of the really eccentric late era ironclads left, so you probably at that point be left taking either Olympia or yeah, the other one would be Scorpion, the Dutch ram ship. Aurora is just the other side. Aurora is a protected cruiser, so yeah, it would be either Olympia or Scorpion rounding it out. So that'd be my 6 core ships. I mean, obviously there's plenty more candidates that you could put in, but that would give you a nice range because you've got 2 Age of Sail ships. You've got an Ironclad era ship. You've got an immediate post-Ironclad era, but still pre-Dreadnought era ship, and then you've got 2 World War I, World War II period ships. Averof would make a very good one as well. Yeah, either Averof or Olympia, you'd have to coin toss over. I think because we've got Midway, Constitution, and New Jersey coming in, I think maybe take Averof instead of Olympia, just so that you can have a nice mix. Ian went to the South American ship is Huascar, but she's very small. Yo Beef Jerky asks, we all know of the fictional HMS Thunderchild and how much of a shame it is the Royal Navy never named a ship Thunderchild. What other fictional naval ships exist which would have been just as cool to see in service if the respective navy had recognised the coolness, and why were they never used? And presuming from the context from the first part, you're talking about reusing names of ships as opposed to bringing the ships themselves into service, because obviously either the ships are realistic, in which case, for the most part, they're just, carbon copies of existing ships, which they had, or they're unrealistic, in which case, they physically couldn't be brought into existence. Thunderchild is actually one of those weird ones in that it sits in the very narrow space where, in theory, it is actually a plausible design, but also not one that existed. So, other fictional ship names that would have been just as cool to see in service. I don't know, to be honest. That's actually something I really don't know that much about, because I haven't read that much naval fiction. About how far too much time reading about naval facts. Jake Miller suggesting HMS Interceptor from Pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, actually, there hasn't been a ship called Interceptor in the Royal Navy. So, yeah, Interceptor's a fairly good one. But, yeah, unfortunately, I am a bit stuck when it comes to naval fiction, because just having not read all that much of it. Someone pointing out Red October. Oh, well, No, they had October Revolution. I don't know. I don't know if the Russian Navy's ever had a ship called Red October. HMS Violent sounds appropriate for the Royal Navy. This is true. Yeah, so sorry about that. I'm a bit stuck on that particular one. October Nid asks, a Lafayette timeline. Okay, in a timeline overall similar to ours, the British Empire is the one to go into near isolation in the aftermath of World War I and the 1920s, whilst the USA steps up onto the stage. Therefore, in 1939, it's France and the USA in issuing ultimatums to Germany over the invasion of Poland, assuming events on land and naval battles play out mostly the same, and the US has about as much warning as the UK in comparison to their historical preparations. The war in the Mediterranean is now a defence of Free French North Africa. So how do the naval battles of 39 and 40 go? That's an incredibly difficult question, because the point of divergence is so far back. You're talking about a point of divergence basically at the Washington Treaty. Because the thing is, the US goes isolationist in the early to mid 1920s, but gradually peels itself out of its isolationism for the most part through the 1930s and into the 40s. So, given that the US is still building, despite being isolationist, it's still building heavy cruisers and such like, or will become heavy cruisers in the 20s, as well as destroyers. If the Royal Navy and Britain are the ones who've gone isolationist in the 1920s, if they follow a similar trajectory to the USA, then they're still going to be building all the 1930s ships, the King George V, the Tribals, the Didos, etc., the Towns. They're still going to be building those as they arc their way back out, the same way the US was building the Brooklyns and the New Orleans, etc. So that means the navies are going to be probably about the same, apart from the fact the treaty is still going to constrain the maximum, so you can't really get that much more. But if in this very, very bizarre timeline you're trying to defend Free French North Africa from across this pond, the main difference when it comes to naval battles of 39-40 is that the only people with fast battleships in existence are the Germans and the French, which is going to be interesting because the Germans will have the Scharnhorsts. The Americans won't have anything capable of catching them the way the British had Hood, Renown and Repulse at the beginning. The French will have Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and if the British are kind of sitting back and watching this all happen, you're therefore much more likely to see Dunkirk and Strasbourg throw down with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau early on, and the Americans are going to be trying to use significant amounts of carrier aviation, I would suspect, to defend French North Africa, which could be interesting actually, because then if by some weird set of circumstances somebody decides that they're going to try and do an American version of Taranto, then obviously there's a lot more American aircraft that can be involved. But yeah, it's see, this is the problem with that kind of alternate history. Unfortunately, there's such a diversion point. After 2 decades of such radical change and a complete upset of World War II, I could basically say almost anything. The Judge 2017. Often games allow you to mix and match technology from different nations. The year is 1939. You're allowed to pick the best ships from across the world. What does your fleet look like? This is a question that's come up a few times before. So it depends where I'm based, because if I'm fighting in the Mediterranean, for example, my choice of submarines is going to be very different to if I'm fighting in the Atlantic to if I'm fighting in the Pacific. Destroyer-wise, my answer is still the same. A mixture of Fletchers and Tribals. I'd be using the Tribals for direct surface action work and the Fletchers as AA escorts and torpedo armed craft. So I'd have mixed, probably half flotillas of Fletchers and Tribals operating together, because they're both pretty good at the anti-surface work, but the Tribals have superior anti-surface firepower for taking on destroyers and stuff, but the Fletchers have more torpedoes to bring to bear and are better at escorting the group as an anti-aircraft unit. Cruiser-wise, if I can just clone cruisers across, I'm probably taking a mixture of Brooklyns and Algeries, unless I can get Belfast subclass because they're a bit chunkier. I might also be persuaded to take Bolzano or Zaras instead of the Algeries, one way or the other, for the heavy cruisers. And then, in 1939, if you're pulling in the capital ships, the problem is no one has any modern fast battleships quite really ready to go in terms of the 35,000 tonners at the very, very beginning of the war. Even King George V, which is one of the soonest ones to come into service, is still kind of working up. You've got the Scharnhorst, that's about it, which means at that point, if you're going to be facing people bringing fast battleships into the equation later on, you're going to have to, and you only have one choice, you basically have to pick, do you want a Hood or do you want Renown? Everything else is slower and therefore not going to be as useful. 39 is a really awkward place to start picking those things. If you can choose designs that are then going to be shortly coming into service, then it gets a lot more interesting, because you have to then kind of split the difference between Richelieu, Littorio, King George V and North Carolina, because obviously if you're picking the best from all over the place, you can fix some of the minor issues, except maybe with North Carolina's hull design, but everything else, like Italian shells and French shells for that matter, they can actually fix. Lord of Epic Randomness asks, would the June 1943 raid on Tokyo Harbour by US subs have had a similar morale effect on the Japanese, or as the Doolittle raid, if the Mark 14 torpedoes had actually worked and any Japanese ships were lost? Not really. The problem with any submarine raid is, one, there's not a visual element to it of the attacking force. Obviously, there's a visual element of exploding ships and sinking ships, but there's something a lot more visceral about actually seeing your enemy. So, if someone flies a bunch of B-25s over your capital, nobody can doubt that your enemy has hit you in a very, very sort of morale important area. Whereas if a bunch of ships randomly explode, it could be anything. It's much easier to propagandize away a bunch of ships sinking in harbour than it is a bunch of aircraft dropping bombs. Also, the ships are valid targets, so the fact that, ships at sea have been torpedoed, well, that's luck of the draw. It's part of war. If you're really, it's happened in Tokyo Bay, but that's unfortunate. We need to step up our anti-submarine warfare efforts, but and you can also make excuses. Oh yeah, well, they sent this many submarines, but our valiant anti-submarine warfare destroyers have destroyed half of them or something like that, and no one can really prove one way or the other otherwise. Whereas a bunch of B-25s fly over your capital and none of them get shot down, it's much harder to actually, much harder to come up with a good explanation as to why this isn't a bad thing. Jeffrey Connolly asks, if the Royal Navy had followed the American method of how they built the Alaskas and developed a large cruiser of their own based off HMS Norfolk, how do you think such a ship would have looked? What would her armament have been, and what use do you see her being put to in World War II? What name would you possibly give such a ship? Well, if they follow the American method of building the Alaskas, then it's not going to see any service in World War II because it'll be completed at the end of it, or near enough at the end. So it might see some brief action running AA escort in the Pacific, but I'm assuming that you're hoping that it will be complete in time for World War II and not after, or a good chunk of the way during it. At which point we kind of know what it would look like. There's various British studies for slightly heavier heavy cruisers with kind of 9-8-inch guns. There's one or two studies looking at super cruisers more along the lines of the Alaskas, but the most common super cruiser designs that get bandied about a lot are ships with 9.2-inch guns. So if the Royal Navy's really going for broke, you're probably going to have a ship with either 9 or 12 9.2-inch guns, and if we're going full on closest to Alaska we can get, then that probably means the 3 quad turret 9.2-inch armed heavy cruiser that's about 22,000 tons, something like that. What would they be used for during World War II? The first thing they'd be used for would be going off and hunting things like Graf Spee. So they'd be used first in hunting down Graf Spee herself, then in security patrols for the convoys, so things like Admiral Scheer's raid, that they'd be countering that. Once the Scharnhorst get in the game, I don't think they'd want to risk them. They'd probably just use the counties to keep an eye on the straits and use capital ships. So once the smaller German raider threat has been defeated, they'd probably be shifted down to the Mediterranean to leaven up the Royal Navy's cruiser forces there against the Italian cruisers. And then once Tirpitz becomes operational, you may well see one or more of them, if they're still surviving, redeployed on Arctic convoy duty, because at that point Scheer and Lutzow are up there, and if Norfolk, Belfast and Sheffield will be quite happy going in to attack Scharnhorst, then I'm pretty sure one of these things leading the formation instead will be happy to go after Scharnhorst as well, as long as it's got friends. Malcolm 55, why the 9.2 is what they went for. Basically, they designed a whole bunch of things. I mean, they had a fairly decent 9.2-inch gun design left over from World War One, and they were going to modify it slightly. But effectively, the British, if you look at the equation at that point between the heavy cruiser gun with 8-inch caliber and the typical battleship gun of 14, 15, 16-inch caliber, there's this intervening field, and in there with the Alaskas, the Americans were obviously going for slightly more towards the battleship scale of gun, whereas the British were going for just the other side of that, with a very powerful and numerous, more towards the end of heavy cruiser scale of gun. Salty Viking 10,022 says, let's say in the Washington Naval Treaty everyone scraps all their battleships and gets to build one class of 5 ships limited to 40,000 tons using the lessons from the war. What would the Royal Navy, US Navy, Japanese Navy, Marine Nationale and Germany have built, assuming Germany gets better treatment? Money is not a factor. Everyone has all the funds they need to build a 40,000 ton battleship class, and the only limitation is 16-inch guns or smaller. So if you're only going to get 5 ships... Sorry, I'm just topping up the Iron Brew. The British are going to be trying to find every which way they can to trim down the G3s to come in at under 40,000 tons. The Americans, I think, are going to be doing a slight redesign of the South Dakotas, the 1920 South Dakota designs. The Japanese are probably going to be doing a G3 style cut down on the Amagis. The Marine Nationale are going to be crying in a corner because they really don't want to be doing any of this. The Marine Nationale is probably the single biggest elephant in the room, because the big 3 navies all have designs that they can slightly rework, possibly to fit the 40,000 ton limit. The Marine Nationale, the biggest thing they've got going is theoretically the Leons, and if you're facing off against South Dakota's G3s and Amagis, even in slightly modified forms, there's no way a Leon's going to cut it, apart from anything else. It's going to be the slowest, not to mention the lightest armed, even if they do have lots of guns. So the Marine Nationale is going to have to come up with something very different, and who knows what they're going to come up with at that point. I certainly don't. Germany, actually, weirdly enough, would be in a better position than France, because Germany is going to be probably rolling out either the L20E Alpha in a modified form or the hybrid crossover fast battleship design that the Kaiser wanted, that they were notionally beginning to sketch out shortly there, right towards the very end of the war. So it would be very much a modification of a napkin design, but it would probably be something in the realm of maybe 26, 27 knots with 8 to 10 16-inch guns. Yippee Rodney 468 says no Italians. Well, the question didn't include them, but you know, if the Italians are going to start with anything, they'll probably start with a baseline of the Francesco Caracciolo's and work their way up from there. Again, you know, the problem with France, weirdly enough, with France and Italy, is they just they never had anything of that kind of size and scale on the books ready to go, so it would be a brand new design. Marlin Stout with a 9.2 inch British guns fire faster than the Alaska's 12 inch. In theory, yes. In theory, they would be faster than the 12 inch. Lord Nelson asks, the Turkish-Italian War of 1911 escalates when the British use the opportunity to invade the Holy Land and South Mesopotamia. Oh yeah, because that's always ended well. Not wanting to miss the fun, the Austrians advance to the Balkans, another place that's always ended well. The Russians invade Anatolia from the Caucasus. Swiftly, the Straits, presumably this is the Straits of the Dardanelles, are seized and put under joint British, Austrian, Russian administration. France and Germany are so enraged they've been left out of an opportunity by their respective allies that a Franco-German alliance is proclaimed. Italy, thinking they should have gotten a seat at the Straits Committee, joins the new alliance as well. War between the two factions, Russia, Britain, Austria versus Germany, France, Italy, is declared in 1914 when Italy demands Trieste. However that's pronounced. With a land war waging mainly in Central and Eastern Europe, how does this war play out navally? Russia, Britain, Austria versus Germany, France, Italy. I mean, it does put the if you like, the central powers, which I suppose Germany, France, Italy are in this case, in a slightly better position, because the French Navy, as much as it's not in the top tier, it's still reasonably challenging. Naval wise, I mean, it's 1911, so the order of battle in terms of dreadnoughts is much closer than you'd think, much closer than it was in World War One. Although 1911 is just about when the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign ships are just about beginning to hit the water, so Britain has a slight superiority. France is only just really bringing its first dreadnoughts into service. And Britain does have a significant numerical advantage, if nothing else, when it comes to battle cruisers. It's going to be a really weird naval war because there aren't enough dreadnoughts or battle cruisers to form the full battle lines of anybody's fleet. So there's going to be an awful lot of late generation pre-dreadnoughts wandering around as well. You're going to have a combined, probably you'd have to have a combined Russian, Austrian, British Mediterranean force trying probably to go after Italy first while the French are still trying to ship troops over from North Africa. Obviously, the British are probably trying to interfere with the French attempts to ferry troops from North Africa, which is going to probably lead to a series of interesting battles in and of itself, whilst the cream of the crop from the British fleet faces off with an angry staring contest with the German fleet. What happens to the Netherlands and Belgium is going to be fun, but obviously now there's French ports accessed for Germany possibly to try to stage the high seas fleet down the channel. It would be a mess of basically trying to. The Britain-Austria alliance would be trying to play whack-a-mole with some of the more pinpoint issues like the French troop convoys or the Italian Navy in general, to enable them to consolidate a hold on the Mediterranean and then square off against the Germans. And exactly how the rest of the war plays out is going to depend very much on how that initial campaign goes. If it goes very well, then the Germans are going to be somewhat contained, whilst obviously Britain primarily tries to build up its naval strength further to get full-on superiority. If it doesn't go so well, then the Allied strength is going to be somewhat eroded, and it's going to be a much closer to parity situation with everybody spread out in little pockets all over the place. Elliot W. James asks, in a recent video from Dr. Alexander Clark, who is in the chat, he discussed the possibility of the Perdicaris affair in 1904 leading to a Franco-US war over Morocco. Had such a conflict occurred, granted the lack of lighter units in the US Navy, with the lack of lighter units in the US Navy, would this be the war to justify the Je ne Col? And can see Teddy Roosevelt trying to take the war to the French and hilarity ensuing. Assuming a Franco-American War occurs in July of 1904 with a Russo-Japanese War still going on, how do these two conflicts interact given the alliance between Russia and France? The Russians aren't going to be in much of a position to do anything about it because they're in the process of throwing everything they've got at Japan. They're separated by most of Europe, so the land conflict's pretty much out of the question. A Franco-American War in July of 1904 is just going to be a very bizarre thing because the Americans have to go a fair distance before they come across anything French that's worth taking. There's a few tiny islands and such, but there's nothing like Cuba was in the Spanish-American War, or Puerto Rico, for the Americans to come and take right on their doorstep. But simultaneously, there's no American colonies apart from the recently acquired Philippines for the French to go after, and the Philippines is far too big for whatever elements the French have in navally in their holdings in the Western Pacific to try and take on. So yeah, both sides are probably going to try and launch into initially some kind of commerce raiding war, almost as if it's the early 19th century again, and then try and feel their way towards somewhere where their two battle fleets might actually meet up. But trying to come up with something that's a big enough threat to motivate one or the other side to send their entire battle fleet and cruiser line whichever way across the Atlantic they're going, that's going to be interesting, to say the least. I think it's possibly slightly more likely that the French might head west than the Americans head east, purely because there are some French colonies in the Caribbean and on the northern coast of South America that the Americans could go after. But then, given that historic French policy in these kinds of wars has always been, let the colonies deal with themselves and wait for the enemy to come to us, the Americans might have to go east if they want a proper resolution to it all. Brad asks, in one Bilge Pumps episode 76, you made a comment about battleship secondary armaments and the usefulness they provided versus the damage they did, and what else could have been used in their place, or at least that's what I think you were asking. What did you have in mind? An only big gunship? I'm trying to think back to that episode of Bilge Pumps. No, yes, I remember that. No, what I was trying to point out there with that particular line of discussion, I was actually trying to point out a fallacy that people sometimes fall into of not, if I'm remembering the particular line of conversation correctly, of where people sometimes assume that just because a system hasn't done something yet or hasn't fulfilled its design criteria, that therefore it's not worth having. So battleship secondary batteries were designed to stop attacking destroyers, as well as later on with dual purpose weaponry to stop attacking aircraft. Now, obviously, outside of a few select instances like the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the secondary batteries never really did much against surface ships. So the idea was basically, well, if you are overly focused, you could go, oh well, this secondary battery doesn't do anything against surface vessels, so therefore we should eliminate it, ignoring the fact it has an AA capability. And there was a corollary to that about World War One, where obviously you don't have dual purpose armament, but when you looked at actually and this was kind of the flip side of the coin, which was if you looked at the secondary batteries and the amount of space and weight they took up, whether they be 4-inch, 5-inch, or 6-inch, versus how much they actually did in World War One, of anything, doing any damage, which fairly minimal. In theory, you could make an argument to remove the secondary batteries on World War One battleships and replace them with more big guns, because those would be more useful at killing the big targets. And with hindsight, and I stress with hindsight, and the way things played out exactly historically, you would have gotten away with just having a few more destroyers instead, because the secondary guns rarely, if ever, did anything. Kuma Flame War asks, have you considered playing Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, and if you have played it, do you like it? Yes, I have played it, off and on, pretty much since it was available to the public. I do like having fun with it. As I've said before, and as I'm working on this series with Brother Monroe, you can come up with some very good approximations. It's not perfect. There's a new patch out which supposedly will make it a lot easier to more directly approximate the old school ships. It's not perfect, but it's certainly, in terms of displacement, visualization, etc., it's certainly a lot closer to being able to recreate historic vessels in a kind of battleship builder scenario than most games I've seen. I'm still getting through the Patreon questions, but we're doing pretty well so far. I've not got too much more to go, I would say. He says, scrolling through everything. Andre Gardner says, do you have a contingency plan in case YouTube decides that naval history is not advertiser-friendly or takes exception to a couple of frames of an intro like it's happened with other history channels? What about a creator-friendly backer and video hosting platform that will allow handling airsoft or other things on a live stream? I'm keeping my options open. I want to see what other platforms, if there are other platforms out there, how they take off, if you like, because I think it was for the Forgotten Weapons channel. They mentioned that you know, I think it's Utreon, which is the latest one that has been launched, but they mentioned that a number of channels or supposed video platforms have gone up. Initially showed a lot of promise and then just died away again. So obviously that wouldn't be a good, you know, thing to kind of have a backup plan that might disappear in a few months. And some others are still around but have a very, very low and very niche user base. And so whether or not that would be suitable or not, I don't know. Also, I mean, it's like, what was it, 6-8 months ago, people were asking me to consider an alternative to Patreon. And so I did my due diligence. I had a look around, and basically I found that if you wanted something that had similar kinds of services to Patreon, they took a bigger cut. So I ended up with less, and more of your guys' money would end up with them. And for the ones that were cheaper, they had far fewer features. So it's kind of it's a rock and a hard place at that point. And some people are there saying use Rumble. Well, I'd have to look into it. And at the moment, between prepping for the America trip and, of course, producing twice as much content in March as I normally would, because I've got to produce the April content as well, looking at alternate video hosting platforms is very much on the back burner for the minute. Maybe May, June, I will start to look around and see if I can come up with a, an case of emergency break glass here scenario, but it's not a massive priority right now. Although, obviously, now that I've said that, if something does happen, I will be obviously look like a complete idiot. But we'll just have to see. We'll have to see what happens. So far, they've left me alone. Well, not all the time. I have had some really stupid arguments and discussions with people in the background over certain things, and of course, they're still being, Studio Canal particular, being idiots about the U-boat film review. So, there's a few things, and for some bizarre reason, my HMS Hood 5-minute guide and my USS Brooklyn 5-minute guide are considered advertiser unfriendly, but whatever. There's only so many hours in the day you can deal with the semi-automated response team at YouTube before you just throw your hands up in the air and walk off. Fireteam Joker says, if America was even more isolationist in the 1920s and didn't participate in the London Naval Treaty, how do you think it would have affected America's battleship design? Do you think they would have just continued to make bigger and bigger standard battleships, or would they have experimented with aircraft carriers so early? Probably wouldn't have experimented with aircraft carriers so early, although they, even before the treaty, they were looking at potential conversion opportunities for the Lexingtons, but it would have been much further down the line than the historical Lexington conversions, even if it was only by 2 or 3 years. But the thing is, I'm assuming by 1920s you mean the Washington Treaty, not the London Treaty. But the thing is, if America's not taking part, no one else is going to, because America's on its way in the 20s to trying to build up the world's biggest fleet. If the rest of the nations at the Washington Treaty board can't get America on board, the British are going to turn around and say, no, sorry, we're just going to have to keep up with them. We can't restrict ourselves. The British were just about able to stomach having the Americans as a joint top top-rate sized navy, they're not going to constrain themselves to becoming a second-tier navy under any circumstances in that time period. Oh yeah, Walter Broad, yes, the Franklin video. That's a whole other mess. The infractions are completely invalid. But to be perfectly honest, the guy who filed them is a freaking nutcase. So given that to take that, see, this is the thing. I would actually rather argue with Studio Canal than the idiot who put in the copyright strike on the Franklin video, because just to explain the background a little bit briefly before I go back to the Patreon questions for the rest of you. If you want to escalate a copyright dispute on YouTube, whether it be a full-on strike or just an initial blocking, you have to submit your details. So you have to submit your real name initially, which, okay, that's fine. But if it's an actual strike and you want to contest it, you have to give your actual name, your actual address, physical home address, email, phone number, etc., because technically you are entering into a proper legal dispute. Now, for all the fact I might rail against Studio Canal and the fact they don't understand the concept of fair use when it comes to using clips out of their film, they are a large, company. So if they receive my personal contact details, I'm relatively sure there's not a lot they're going to do that's malicious in terms of misusing it. Whereas the guy who filed the takedown copyright notice on the Franklin video, I actually tried to contact him first, tried to be reasonable and figure out what the heck his problem was in the first place, and if it was any way that things could be dealt with. And if you saw the amount of crazy, unhinged vitriol and bile that he spewed off, as well as a bunch of outright lies, which were hilarious, which I knew to be outright lies because he was referencing certain people saying certain things, which, I happen to know those people personally, and I know that he was talking a bunch of complete nonsense. But regardless, and then doing a little bit of digging around myself, I was like looking at some of the other stuff he'd said at various points in public. The guy was complete. Nick Pokershake asking, "Can you have a lawyer do that on your behalf rather than your personal details?" No, at least as far as I'm aware, the YouTube system explicitly wants the content creators' details. But anyway, no, the guy was a complete unhinged loon. Probably still is. And given that he was an individual already clearly quite unstable, there was no way on this planet I'm ever giving him my personal email, home address, and phone number. There are easier and less inventive ways of committing suicide, frankly. Yes, it's a tragedy that to me that video is taken down, but I can re-record it in a slightly different format and do it again at some point when I have the time, and just let the idiot stew in his own juices, frankly. Hopefully he'll just... Actually, no, that sounds a bit too harsh. I'm going to leave it there because my true feelings on that matter go very deep and very aggressive, and let's not take that any further. Frank Spazzato, have you ever asked Jingles for help or advice? I've talked to Jingles a few times, but to be honest, I don't really want to bother him with this kind of stuff. I mean, Jingles has enough things to worry about without me spouting off about random morons on the internet. He's got more than enough random morons on the internet of his own to deal with. Anyway, Mark Wakuzik asks, what would have happened if the attack on Pearl Harbor was met with an empty reception, i.e. the Pacific Fleet had left for fleet problem or training exercise, or if there was suddenly poor weather after the aircraft took off from the carriers? Was there an emergency plan that Japan had? IO2, they don't care. They literally don't care. Big business doesn't care. Anyway, so yeah, if emergency plans, if Pearl Harbor for whatever reason is non-viable, yes, the Japanese did have a couple of backup plans. It basically depends on how exposed the attack is. So if there's poor weather, so the aircraft take off, they arrive somewhere in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor, and let's say the entirety of the Hawaiian island chain is covered in fog and cloud from 0 feet all the way up to 10,000 feet, and it's absolutely solid. It's like flying into grey candy floss. You can't see a thing, or some variation thereof. Maybe there's a massive storm at the site of the Japanese carriers and they can't launch. So effectively the attack itself has not been detected. The Japanese plan was to just basically quietly go home and pretend it never happened. Whereas if the attack is visible, so let's say, it's a lovely clear day the way that it historically was, the Japanese aircraft show up and there's nothing to attack, well, they had secondary targets to go after, and stuff. They did actually go after the airfields, the sort of bits and pieces of infrastructure around the harbour. So if the Pacific Fleet's not there, it's a massive problem, but they're still going to attack something and blow that up, and then race back to the carriers and start a very desperate search to try and figure out where the Pacific Fleet actually has gone. So it's basically kind of a case of, if it's deniable, they're going to deny it and pretend like it didn't happen. If it's too late, then they're going to blow something up and then go hunting. Graham William Kidd asks, this is a question from the recent live Q&As I didn't ask but really liked. Nelson and Rodney do not get built. There's therefore 18 16-inch rifles to use, and they get used in 3 heavy super battle cruisers. Could you please describe these ships and an alternate history they make up until there are too many butterflies? Okay, so basically the British can't build Nelson and Rodney, but they have the guns for whatever reason. They have to build 3 heavy battle cruisers. Well, if you're building 3 and you've got 18 guns, then that means you're building 3 6-gun ships, i.e. you're building slightly bigger versions of Renown. So I suspect at that point you would probably be looking at, you can't really downscale Hood, because increasing Hood from twin 15s to twin 16s but removing a turret, given Hood's already, actually no, I was trying to fit them in the same displacement limit, but you might be able to pull that off if you took Hood's armor layout, or the modified armor layout they were going to use on the other Admiral class. If you then switch the 15s for 16s, they're still twin. Make them twins, and drop them down to 3 turrets. You can shorten the ship because and reduce the machinery because you don't have the weight or the length for the X-barbette and turret. You might be able to start pushing at 35,000 tons. Or I suppose the other thing, if you really want to go radical, is take the triple turrets, put 2 triples forward, make an all-forward design, shorten the Citadel up massively. You can almost certainly drop it down to 35,000 tons at that point. So you've still got 6 16-inch guns per ship, but they're now in 2 triples forward. And with a hood style armor, that could be quite interesting charging around. And then of course you have Hood, Renown, Repulse, and these 3 things, which now means that just under half the British fleet is high speed. Yeah, that would be Interesting. I mean, I designed a alternate hood with 3 forward triple 15s, which I think I put in a Drydock at one point. I want now I'm curious. I think at some point over the next few days I'm going to fire up Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts and see what I can create in terms of 6 16-inch gun 35,000 ton battle cruiser. I'm going to have fun with that one. Clayton Bradish, World War One. If the Italians join the Central Powers, but are as successful in crossing the French Alps as they are in attacking the Austrians, not much. But now there's a massive Italian-Austrian fleet in the Mediterranean. The Americans have joined the war early, so the British send the majority of their fleet to the Mediterranean. Why would they do that? The Americans send virtually their entire navy upon entry to blockade Germany. The problem is the Germans outnumber the US fleet at that point. So now everything else is the same, and we have the Battle of Jutland, but with the Americans as the Grand Fleet. But they still have Beatty's battle cruiser squadron for the battle. And the Pennsylvania class has been available until what happens now. If the British, for some bizarre reason, have all gone wandering off into the Mediterranean, an early American versus high seas fleet fight, let's say 1915, is not going to end well. The high seas fleet actually has, I'm pretty sure, more dreadnoughts. Let's double check. So the Americans have the South Carolinas, although they didn't really even count them as dreadnoughts. Even before World War One, the South Carolinas were kind of leading the pre-dreadnoughts rather than accompanying the main battle fleet. So you've got the 2 Delawares, you've got the 2 Floridas, you've got Wyoming and Arkansas, so that's 6. New York and Texas is 10. Nevada and Oklahoma is 12. Okay, someone's sending me a message. And you're saying fast track the Pennsylvanias. So you got 14. At the Battle of Jutland, you are actually still outnumbered. So the US fleet would be slightly outnumbered by the Germans at Jutland. They would have a battle cruiser technical superiority, but then it's Beatty and his battle cruiser, so that's not going to last too long. Yeah, that's not going to end well, I don't think. I mean, that would be a fight the Germans would quite happily accept, and would probably fight it out very hard. And of course, the Americans don't have, if the entire Royal Navy's gone south, they don't have much in the way of a cruiser or destroyer screen in 1916 either. So actually, that's probably a loss for the Americans. The only good thing about it would be that if the entirety of the Grand Fleet has decamped to fight the Italians and the Austrians in the Mediterranean, that's going to be a very short, very sharp fight, which is going to end very badly for the Italians and Austrians. At which point, when the British show back up again, the Germans may have won a new Battle of Jutland, but there's going to be so few of them left, because the Americans will go down fighting, that the British could either blockade the Germans back into port or sweep up what's left. A salty potato. If you had the opportunity to go back in time from between World War I and II and tell one nation that they absolutely should not build a class of ship, which nation and class would it be? And then which class from any nation do you think they should build instead? Ships replaced on a 1-for-1 basis from a roughly similar time period to avoid a Fletcher swarm replacing the Arethuses, etc. Okay, so I can tell a nation you can't build this ship, but you can build this other similar vessel. See, the more obvious choices to me are Axis ships, but I don't really want to help the Axis by making them build better ships, so... That's a very difficult one, actually. I mean, there's a few easy ones, like telling the Americans don't build the North Carolinas. Here's a slightly from the future South Dakota class design, which is, they're both 35,000-ton treaty ships, except the South Dakotas are slightly better protected and don't suffer quite so much from the vibration issues. And again, it would be relatively easy and obvious to tell the British not to build the King George V, but here's a 1942 Lion class design or something. Build that instead. I mean, you could tell the Americans not to build Wasp and just build Hornet early, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah, I think those would be the ones I could come up with. And yes, there's a couple of people pointing out, yeah, if you want to hear my slightly angry, sarcastic takes on more modern stuff, the Bilge Pumps podcast is the place to go, because that's very, very much an opinion-based show. Although, to be honest, I think I put a little bit more venom. No, actually, I wouldn't say. I haven't put more venom into some of the Fun Fridays than Bilge Pumps. I do get some proper rants going in Bilge Pumps. Just ask Dr. Clark if he's still around on here. The Almighty Hypnotoad, Lord High Commander of Newfoundland, Labrador and the Grand Banks, asks... Okay, a coup by the Carlists with support from the White Russian exiles in 1924 results in the Infante Jaime, Duke of Madrid, being named King Jaime III. The next year, a referendum in France proclaims him as Jacques I. The legitimatists rigged the vote, resulting in France and Spain joining a personal union. Assuming this new state of France-Spain stabilises in 27, the Spanish Civil War doesn't happen. The White Russians form a government in exile in this new state. The Washington Naval Treaty is re-signed, and the new Franco-Spanish Kingdom guarantees the independence of Poland. How will the naval war be affected in World War II if in this scenario the French side collapses but the Germans are stopped at the Pyrenees? Or scenario 2, the new country falls as France did historically. If in the latter scenario, if the Franco-Spain falls as France did historically, well then where is the Vichy government? Is the Vichy government all of Spain plus a bit of southern France? Is it proportionally the same? In which case it's probably like Spain or something. I mean, the Spanish economy is not exactly brilliant, so although they've theoretically got a larger economic base, the best thing the new country can probably hope for is completing a few of the pre-existing Marine Nationale stuff a bit sooner. If the French side collapses but the Germans are stopped at the Pyrenees, so i.e. Franco-Spain continues the war, that's probably the bigger change, because then this alternate Marine Nationale, or I suppose at that point possibly Franco-Spanish Royal Navy, if they haven't given up, then they're going to continue fighting on. And okay, with a bit more money, etc., going for them, they might have the Richelieus or equivalent, at least Richelieu, possibly even Jean Bart, complete in time. And if they don't, they can complete them, because they will still have access to shipyards in the southern portion of their new land. And they thus, if they keep fighting on, then that could lead to some very interesting battles. Again, we get to see Richelieu fight Bismarck, possibly, or possibly fight Latoria, or possibly both. Who knows? That could be quite fun, but yeah, I don't think it's going to see a massive increase in the size of the nation's navy. Apart from obviously integrating some ships. There might be a few extra cruisers and destroyers here and there, but the Spanish economy was not great in the interwar period, and to be honest, neither was the French. Jim Smitty says, in the past, Drydock, you stated how within the Imperial German Navy there was a host of officers who came up with a host of reasons for events that happened to everything, but reason for events that happen, but not which there. Basically, the Imperial German officers come up with all sorts of reasons why their codes haven't been broken, and it's something else. I always wonder if there was some tactical trick they could have done if they knew their codes were broken to destroy part of the British Grand Fleet, like, say, raiding the Harwich Force or Dover Patrol with 1st Scouting Group, with the High Seas Fleet being held as a covering force to help pull 1st Scouting Group out once the battle cruiser fleet shows up. So my question is this: assuming Admiral Scheer decides that yes, the codes are broken, how could he use this advantage in an effort to trap and destroy part of the Grand Fleet? Could he try to raid the Harwich Force or Dover Patrol, or does the math make that impossible, and he would have to try for some form of Jutland? So if he's trying to destroy part of the Grand Fleet, probably almost certainly the battle cruisers, then his best bet at that point is going to be... his best bet would be to... I think probably do another battle cruiser raid, similar to the ones he'd done before. Have the High Seas Fleet out there in support, much as had been done before by some of his predecessors, but then basically issue all the orders via personal courier and telephone. So have no transmissions of any kind at all relating to anything other than the 1st Scouting Group sailing, and then set up a bunch of dummy transmitters in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel to pretend to be the High Seas Fleet just doing their regular day-to-day chatter, whilst the High Seas Fleet is actually at sea. That, if the Royal Navy, through its code-breaking efforts, then is convinced that the High Seas Fleet is in port and only 1st Scouting Group is coming out, they might then send just BT and maybe one battle squadron, like they did with Vice Admiral Warrender, to try and intercept them, at which point, the High Seas Fleet gets the battle it actually wants. Right. Oh, there's a few to go. Right, let's try and get crack on. Capitano Lorenzo, when the Germans surrendered their capital ships to Scapa Flow after World War I, did Royal Navy engineers have opportunities to do technical examinations of any of the vessels prior to scuttling? No, they didn't, because the German crews were still aboard. They were not... Although the High Seas Fleet had surrendered, they were technically just being held there until the armistice term, the final surrender terms were worked out, because it was just they were just under an armistice. So the Royal Navy couldn't swarm over and examine in detail all of the ships. They did absolutely take apart and examine a couple of German ships after the scuttling, Baden, for example. But that was basically just the ones they were able to prevent from fully sinking afterwards. Most of the ships that went down during the scuttling had never had thorough technical examinations done on them by the Royal Navy, and wouldn't, because they'd stay on the bottom for quite a while, and by the time they'd been brought up, anything you might have learned from them was pretty irrelevant. SPR Ninja, assume on the night of 14th of November 42, Washington is replaced by Salem, USS Salem in 1949 spec. Assuming Admiral Lee has knowledge of Salem's systems equivalent to his knowledge of Washington, the crew performs to the same standard. How does the battle play out differently? Big questions. Can the 8-inch 55 Mark 16 penetrate an 11-inch belt at 6,000 yards? Yes, it can. Doesn't matter, though, because Kirishima doesn't have an 11-inch belt. How much more does the more advanced radar change the layout of the battle? A little bit, but most of the ID issues when it comes to South Dakota and stuff are still going to exist. How much damage does 90 rounds per minute of 8-inch AP do to a Congo? A lot, because it's just going to punch through everything bar the turrets, maybe. Will the rate of fire give Lee the ability to engage other targets at the same time? No. For all its rate of fire, the 8-inch shell obviously has considerably less destructive power than a 16-inch shell. So if Lee as per the question, knows exactly what the capabilities of Salem are, he is going to want to pump 8-inch rounds into Kirishima until he can absolutely tell that Kirishima is down. Now, that might happen a little bit quicker, and he will, with the radar, will also obviously have more opportunity to engage some of the other targets, some of the other cruisers, but engaging other Japanese targets is going to wait till after he's put Kirishima down. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, if the aircraft carrier was never thought of or invented, how do you think naval combat during World War II would have been? Or would it be more World War One? Would the emphasis be on cruisers, subs, battleships, or something else? So if there's no aircraft carriers at all, in theory, you've still got the threat of shore-based aircraft, so secondary batteries, anti-aircraft guns, etc. are still definitely going to be a thing. Although you might see somewhat less in terms of light AA. You might actually see more of an emphasis on heavy anti-aircraft weapons, because if you've not got any aircraft carriers, then the vast majority of strike aircraft are going to be probably twin-engined, or in the case of the Italians, 3-engined, long-range maritime aircraft based on land. And so barrage fire by long-range heavy anti-aircraft guns will probably be seen as more effective, because without carriers you're not going to have small single-engine torpedo bombers and dive bombers swarming all over unless you get too close to the shore. The flip side is, of course, you won't also have any carrier-based fighters to protect you if you get too close to the enemy shore, which is going to create an interesting kind of no man's land where navies are not going to want to get so close that light enemy attack aircraft can get close to you, but simultaneously may be less concerned by the long range stuff. Christian Slot Hulk asks an alternate history question. I previously asked 2 questions in which part of the answer was HMS Lion and Vanguard get sent to intercept Bismarck and Prince Eugen. If Vanguard and Lion are sent to intercept the German ships, both have equal combat readiness to King George V historically, and all other events play out as they did historically. And in the second case, Vanguard and Lion are sent to intercept the Germans, of it being followed by 2 Royal Navy cruisers with end-of-war radars. How does this go? Okay, so if Lion and Vanguard are kicked back in time and then sent out to engage Bismarck and Prince Eugen, assuming Holland is in control, you're probably actually going to see the night action that he wanted to do with Hood and Prince of Wales, especially if Norfolk and Suffolk have late war radars, they're probably not going to lose contact, so they'll be able to relay all the necessary information to him. But even if they're not, if it's just Lion and Vanguard, if they've got their late war post-war radars, they can probably see Bismarck and Prince Eugen at a long enough range on radar anyway to make the night intercept, and then they fight the kind of crossing the T battle at close range that Holland wanted. So it's probably going to be a very, very vicious fight, and with the accuracy imparted by the late war radar, given Vanguard's performance admittedly on exercises, it's going to be a short, sharp and nasty engagement. Vanguard probably be assigned to deal with Prince Eugen, and Lion deals with Bismarck. Excelsior 1. How well would Scharnhorst have fared if the Kriegsmarine had developed 12s instead of 11-inch? Given the fact that barbettes and magazines would have to be even bigger, could they have gotten the 31 knots or even 30? If Scharnhorst had been designed for 12s, they probably would have made the ship just a fraction larger to accommodate that. It's not a huge increase in caliber and therefore weight of firepower. There would be a bit more. Obviously the guns and the magazines, the shell handling rooms, etc., all going to have to be a little bit larger. But I think given the specs, if they decided we're going to build the Scharnhorst with 12s, they would have just, as I added, maybe a couple of 1,500 tons more to the ship, and kept, they could have still easily kept it at 30, 31 knots, quite comfortably, because it's a small enough change. Oh boy, I'm almost through the iron brew, and even the sugar's not keeping me awake. You can tell how tired that's making me. Todd Webb, if the land war in France in World War I ends as disastrously as World War II or the Franco-Prussian War, and France collapses within a couple of months, could the Kaiserliche Marine have forced the channel for a World War I Sea Lion? Okay, so basically Sea Lion World War I. No. Not on paper. So, as I've said before, 1914 was probably the closest that the German High Seas Fleet had to winning a Jutland-style confrontation. But forcing that in the Channel near the beginning of the war is probably the least good way of doing that. Because it means that the Harwich force comes into play. Basically anything that the British can scramble, including pre-dreadnoughts of that were the pre-dreadnoughts that eventually Dreadnought would lead, and so forth. Basically, it allows the British to throw everything they can at the Germans in a relatively small, confined environment that the British have charted, recharted, and fought and refought over for centuries. So it's basically the ideal location for the Royal Navy to set up, and they can block. They don't. The Grand Fleet isn't in the Channel. They can wait for the High Seas Fleet to enter the Channel, block the Channel at the Dover Straits, and sweep down the Channel. And then the Germans are outnumbered, surrounded, and either have to run out of fuel and die, stand and die, or try and break back through the entirety of the Grand Fleet, with the British having a lot more destroyers and cruisers than them, and die. So, if France collapses that quickly in World War I, the Germans immediately trying to force an Operation Sea Lion in the Channel is probably the best way to throw away any advantage they've just gained. Edward Franklin Woods, using modern metallurgic and ballistic advances, what would you expect a World War I or II naval fleet to look like? Armour-wise and such, probably not very different. What modern metallurgic advances have been made don't really apply too much to armour plate and ship structures. There'd be a slight difference, a slight improvement, but not enough of one to make all that much of an odds. The ballistic advances would be much more interesting because, assuming that we've got some modern sensors to play with, then in World War I or II, the range obviously can be far, far further. You can have sabot shells, you can have guided shells, and all sorts of fancy things with massively improved armor penetration characteristics, just as long as they've got the radar to be able to actually exploit that range. So, assuming that the modern advances include a radar to improve the range, then ships are going to be engaging sort of over the horizon using relayed information from scouting vessels. If it's purely the metal and the metallurgy and the ballistic advances on guns that have changed, then very rapidly armour may find itself being obsolete because they're going to have stupidly powerful guns, and the metal for the armour has not advanced enough to really resist that, except at extreme long ranges, which they can't fire at because they don't have the fire control and radar advances, so they're going to end up basically point blank shooting each other with stupid, almost railgun equivalents. Swe420 Den says, suppose the Allies use the original plan at Gallipoli and just run through the Dardanelles with the naval force only. Sure, they can threaten to shell Constantinople, but does that actually get them anything? World War II showed us that bombing cities does not cause an enemy nation to capitulate, as shown by the tenacity that the Turks fought with during the war. They did not lack a fighting spirit. Is the Admiralty's assumption of just by placing a fleet outside the city the height of colonial arrogance? thinking that gunboat diplomacy could actually end war with a great power. What's there to stop the Turks from closing the straits behind the fleet and just waiting for those ships to run out of ammo, food and coal while they're surrounded in the Sea of Marmara? Basically, the panic that would occur in the city. Combination of cutting Constantinople, Istanbul, whatever you want to call it, off from trade, which would cause problems in and of itself, plus you're personally threatening the safety of the rulers, who are then faced with a catch-22. If they stick around, you can shell them if they don't agree with you, at which point you can then install your preferred rulers, and if they run away, they would delegitimize themselves in the view of the time as the rightful rulers of the place, plus, to say, the panic of the citizenry, who probably don't want to be shelled by large numbers of enemy warships. Plus, in 1914, whilst they did have a secret treaty, the Turks were much, much more on the edge as to whether or not they were going to get involved. It took Goeben and Breslau arriving, plus their crews, plus a lot of diplomatic work with the Germans to gradually get them to come over to fully embrace being on Germany's side. So if you're faced with a whole host of downsides from being personally shelled out of your palace by combined British-French force, everyone's panicking in the streets, and you weren't particularly at that point particularly enamoured with following the Germans down this path anyway, that could actually potentially force the Turks out of the war. And yeah, there's no easy way to quickly close the straits behind the fleet. You've got to remember that they, compared to the initial 1914 opportunity, the Turks had several months with help from advisors to massively strengthen the defences. It's not the kind of thing you can throw in overnight, especially if, you know, the Allies are smart and have left a guard ship or two. Unemployed History Major says, Drac, you've compiled such a vast collection of information. Have you considered using your website as a sort of wiki, putting all the scripts and allowing for edits by selected members, etc., etc., and each script could have the links and sources to allow for more information gathering? I've thought about it, but to be honest, it would take such a huge amount of time to manage. I'd probably end up having to employ someone just to do that, and yeah, it's something that maybe to consider for the far distant future. But you've got to also remember that there's usually multiple copies of my scripts, so you'll have the final script that makes it to, the turn into a video, and then you'll have the expanded version of the script, which is a little bit more disjointed but contains a lot more information, which is the first draft, which is the thing that I then wind down into whether it's a 5-minute format or a 45-minute format. So which one would you upload at that point? Also, obviously I have a certain style of delivery, and that includes the kind of sarcasm and humour, which comes off, I think, relatively well when I'm talking, but maybe doesn't. I don't know if that would come off quite as well in text form. But to be honest, it's the main thing at that point is just the sheer amount of time it would take to do. I mean, Mrs. Drac has been diligently scanning photos, and to be honest, much as I'd love to upload them, and I did put some of the ironclad ones up earlier, finding time to upload them is probably going to be in my rest and recovery period when I get back from the States. There's only so much of me to go around. Admiral Tiberius, if Operation Unthinkable had happened at the close of World War II in Europe, or if the Soviets had attacked the Western Allies, was there any sort of naval operations the Western Allies could have carried out against the Soviets? Not really. Not on a major war-winning scale. Yes, they could carry out naval operations. They could go into the Baltic. They could go into the Black Sea. They could go into the Barents Sea for all that matters. But there's only so much you can do at that point. Especially considering the front line's going to be in Germany, or what's left of it. I mean, you could mount airstrikes etc. from the North Sea or the Mediterranean. But why would you risk your naval forces and your, relatively speaking, light carrier aircraft when you'd have thousands upon thousands of bombers and fighters and fighter bombers, all land-based, based a lot closer? Why get the Navy involved in that? It's like an Operation Unthinkable is very much mostly going to be a ground war. The Baltic is a bit lousy with Soviet subs anyway. So you'd establish very quickly dominance in the North Sea, dominance of the Mediterranean, but then it would just be a case of mostly acting as a logistic support force and point attack on the flanks. Last two Patreon questions, then we're on to the Super Chats. Dr. D.M. Platt, follow-up to my question about placing spies on ships during the battle. You're allowed to place your spies on both enemy and friendly ships. Or separate question. Okay, I'll do this one instead because, to be honest, my brain works easier with it. It says, in a number of your videos, you discuss gaming-related things like rolling natural 1s or 20s. Can you just please explain those terms as well as things like bow tanking? Okay, so bow tanking, that admittedly has come of kind of a little bit in from people playing World of Warships, which it basically involves pointing your bow either directly or very slightly off angle towards your opponent, thus increasing the apparent angle of your belt armor quite considerably, which ups the protection of your belt against penetration. It can kind of work. The problem that you would run into realistically trying to do that is the fact that if you're near enough bow on, you're also quite heavily exposing your forward bulkheads, and also your superstructure is kind of stopping any shells that would otherwise have gone straight over the ship, and your command staff are there. So going head on or near enough head on is not actually quite as useful in real life as it would appear to be in games. There is a certain amount to be said for minimizing your target profile and increasing your apparent armor profile by angling your ship. But one, it's a slightly greater angle than your traditional bow tank would be in a game. And secondly, any kind of extreme angling, you also are disabling your ability to shoot at your enemy from your rear turrets, which most navies consider to be a bit more important. Rolling natural 1s and 20s, that's a reference to D&D and a whole bunch of other tabletop RPG systems, including like most of the 40k stuff, the Dark Heresy stuff, where if you roll a natural 1 on a d20, a 20-sided dice, it's an automatic failure, whereas if you roll a natural 20, it's an automatic success. But both are well, I say relatively speaking unlikely. They're held to be relatively unlikely, although technically there's a 1 in 20 chance of rolling either of them, and the same as there is for rolling any other number, but there's only a 1 in 10 chance of rolling a 1 or a 20 versus a 9 in 10 chance of rolling any other number. And so basically to say you rolled a natural 1 basically means you have unfortunately failed disastrously, and rolling a natural 20 is that congratulations, against all the odds you have magically succeeded in the best possible way. And that, I believe, is the end of the Patreon questions, which is just as well because my brain is starting to sing. Just a very high-pitched tune. Okay, so I'm going to go through the Super Chat questions now, and then if I'm still somewhat coherent, we'll try and do a few questions from the... we'll try and do a few more questions from the chat if we can. But let's see how we get through these. Trains Kings asks, your 1v1 video on Fridays kind of scared me a bit when you talked about your 6 reasons. I don't ever want to be within 5 miles of a mad drac. Oh, obviously I let a little bit more emotion into some of that than I normally do, but all I'll say, as I'm sure Mrs. Drac can verify, when I've been angry with people that have annoyed or insulted her, there's Angry Drac that rants in the occasional Fun Friday video, which is me being irritated. Mad. If I'm mad, yeah, you'll know. You'll know. That's all I'll say. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Drac, if you're listening?
I'd say you'd be very lucky to actually witness this at all.
Well, there you go. Semi-impartial witness. Being half Bolivian, I have a very long fuse, but also an absolutely volcanic temper when that fuse finally reaches its end. That's all I'll say. Paul Brunner, have you put any thought into someone paying for a specific video, i.e. a Wednesday special or the like? How much would it cost? To pay for the entire content of a Wednesday video? Hasn't really actually crossed my mind before, so I genuinely don't know. I suppose the only thing that immediately comes to mind would depend on who was asking, because obviously if an organisation is asking me to do something on their behalf, or as a well, not necessarily as a collaboration, but if they want me to do a particular video that's going to highlight some of the work they're doing, and it's outside of my normal schedule, then obviously that's one thing that would attract a certain amount of, I think, paying for my time. Whereas if it's a viewer, perhaps with a very personal connection to a subject, and they're able to facilitate part of the video by providing that in the first place. And, something like, my grandfather fought on this ship, he had these stories to tell, could you do a video on that? Well, at that point you're providing me with part of the information to help do a video, and bringing a heretofore mostly unknown element of naval history to light. I don't think I'd feel comfortable charging anyone for that. And I'm sure there's probably some intervening period in between the two, but it's not something I've actually thought about in all that much detail, to be honest. Because as I said, my list of Wednesday videos is, I'm not going to run out of topics anytime soon. Pegamixel asks, now that's a good play on words. Also reminds me of Pegamastex if you play Ark Survival Evolved. Anyway, Pegamixel asks, with the usual concern against new military technologies, was there any scepticism from within the Royal Navy against the use of shell guns on ships of the line from the early to mid-1900s and onwards? Initially, yes, because it was even larger amounts of gunpowder having to be stored on the ships and possibly even on gun decks, which, a Navy that's concerned about fire on wooden warships is even less enthusiastic about large amounts of explosives scattered around the decks. There's a reason why the powder monkeys were running up and down during the battle, taking the charges from the magazines rather than just stacking the magazines around the decks. Stacking the charges around the decks. So yeah, early on there was some concern, combined with the fact that early shell guns were hilariously unreliable in terms of where the shell was going to go and whether or not it was actually going to explode on contact, or at all. So yeah, there was a bit of resistance, but not a huge amount once it was demonstrated that they could actually be somewhat reliable. Certainly there was a lot less resistance to it compared, if you compare it to some of the other elements of naval developments, which elements of the Royal Navy resisted a lot more strongly. Chazzik says you missed a few late Drydock questions. I hope I didn't. I mean, I was recording. I was recording the Patreon Drydock even, like, as I said earlier today. In fact, it's literally the Patreon recorded element of the Drydock has literally just finished rendering. So once this is done, I'm going to have to upload that. And that's the last of the Iron Brew. Galdar Ioni, you're a particularly cunning orc, painted purple, infiltrating the Royal Navy Admiralty in 1939. What's the most orky ship you can get them to build? The K-25 cruiser design. I think it's option 6 or 7, or is it option G? Something like that. Anyway, it's the Dido to make the Atlantas envious. Quad stack 5.25s forward, quad stack 5.25s aft, torpedo launchers down the side. That is about as close to being an orc vessel as you can possibly get, because it's basically 30% firepower by volume. Colin Cameron, I missed my question about the reaction of the US Italians to a UK German World War I victory. It's not here at the moment. I'm going to check. I'll have to check because the legacy has been quite the legacy has been quite helpful in cataloguing some of the super chats. So I may have missed one or two, but if he did, I'll obviously just double check that later. I'm just going through the ones I copied down at the beginning. Jeff D. In October 2021, an Ecuadorian Navy 3-mast sail training ship intercepted and captured a narco speedboat smuggling drugs. Good on them. Pity they didn't let it have a full broadside. Catch Bay. Are there theories that if the Japanese had conquered Hawaii and closed the Panama Canal, that they could have operated freely in the Pacific? I'm sure there are, but to be perfectly honest, if the Japanese had somehow managed to find the forces to conquer Hawaii and reach all the way across the Pacific to close the Panama Canal, they could have done pretty much whatever they liked, because they're running on space magic at that point. The Japanese... In theory, the Japanese could have launched an attack on an invasion of Pearl Harbor. They had the transport ships, and well, obviously the fact that Kido Butai reached strike range and was able to go home again shows that they could get a war fleet there. But to take that fleet and a theoretical fleet of troop transports to attack Hawaii, yes, you could do that. You could launch the invasion, but it's probably going to be a one-way trip for most of those ships. You could, in theory, do another at-sea refueling, which is what they did just to get the Kido Butai to their launch point anyway. You could, in theory, do that to keep cruisers and battleships off of Hawaii for a little bit to help with shore bombardment, even though they're not trained in it. So it's theoretically possible for the Japanese to launch an invasion. Whether or not that's going to be successful is another matter entirely. Answer, almost certainly not. They've certainly got no way of sustaining it and supplying that invasion. So it's basically a case of win or die within the first week or so. But even if they manage to do that, there's no way they can stage all the way across to the east coast and therefore attack the Panama Canal in any significant numbers. I mean, even the subs that were planning to go there had to be specific, almost not quite specifically built, but there were very limited numbers of them. Visual Dawn, who wins in a ship v ship 1v1 night battle between Yamato and Iowa? I just did a video about this. But no, to be fair, you did say night battle, so statistically Iowa should win the night battle with its superior radar. Robert Dennett, HMS Anson and Richelieu, escorted by 3 W-class destroyers versus Tirpitz and Prince Eugen engaging off the recently lost port of Gibraltar in daytime, based on recent video games I've played. That should be an Allied win, because you've got two fully capable treaty battleships facing off against a single Bismarck-class battleship. And, okay, you know, 3 destroyers. Well, the thing is, you could either split, so one battleship goes after Prince Eugen, which shouldn't last very long. The other holds on its own with Tirpitz, and either Anson or Richelieu are perfectly capable of holding their own with Tirpitz long enough for the other to come and help once they finish off Prince Eugen. And then it's kind of a coin toss of, are the 3 destroyers helping to finish off Prince Eugen even faster, or are they supporting the solo battleship that's going up against Tirpitz and dropping torpedoes into the water just to make Tirpitz's day a little bit more difficult? But yeah, in theory, the Allied force should win that. Tyler Kuhn, with no Washington Treaty, how would you redesign the Pensacola-class cruisers? How I would do it, or how the US Navy would do it? Because they wanted a high-speed 8-inch cruiser, and a lot of their run-up designs were distressingly poorly armoured anyway, even without the Washington Treaty coming into effect, because they needed relatively lightweight ship for the speed. But I mean, assuming that I'm putting on something approximating a US Navy hat and taking some of the previous designs they were looking at, it would probably involve making the ship just a slightly larger, slightly beamier, slightly longer, so that you can get triples. So instead of triples superfiring over twins, you'd have triples over triples. You're probably talking about a ship in the order of 13 to 14,000 tons. So it's got 12 8-inch guns. Maybe the armour's slightly boosted so it can at least have some decent chance against 6-inch gunfire. So maybe a 4-inch belt overall. And retaining the high speed. So that, I would suspect, would be a likely option for the US Navy if the Pensacola's didn't have to abide by treaty regs. But it would be an interesting ask trying to get it past Congress, considering the next largest thing down they built cruiser-wise was the Omahas. Soggle, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind words and the donation. And yes, I do know that sometimes the Drydock has a sleep aid. That's perfectly fine. There's a bunch of content creators I listen to that I use as sleep aids, and actually, to be perfectly honest, it works out better for everyone, because I get to go to sleep relatively quickly and calmly, and they get multiple views because I'm watching their videos or listening to them, I suppose, at that point, because I actually want to hear what they say. So if I drift off halfway through the video, I end up listening to it again. Kieran B, with a rise in Chinese building of ships, that's a modern question, which, as I say, I'm not going to cover on this channel, especially at the moment. There's absolutely no way I'm towing the line on well, I'm definitely towing the line on making sure that I'm abiding by my own principles of not covering modern political stuff or modern stuff generally. But what I will do, Kieran, is I'm going to copy this into the bilge pumps chat, so when we record bilge pumps on Friday, when we record bilge pumps on Monday, will all 3 of us have a little bit of a shot at that question, I think. So there you go. I have no idea how to even begin to start pronouncing that name, but hopefully you'll know who you are. So it's new to the channel. Great work, thank you very much. Are you ex-military, or is it a hobby for you? Well, it's my job now. I personally am not ex-military, although that kind of makes me the second generation out of about 40 not to be. My grandfather's generation, his 3 older brothers were all in the military. He wasn't, mainly because he was too young to sign up. His father, so my great grandfather, was in the military, and then that kind of kicks off a very, 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 very long line of family in the military that includes fighting in the wars with France around when the Duke of Marlborough was around. It includes fighting at the Battle of Agincourt. It includes fighting the Scottish several times, including my direct ancestors and my wife's direct ancestors meeting up. Mrs. Drack, how many was it? 3 or 4 times? Our families have fought each other in various Anglo-Scottish wars?
4, I think.
4. And of course, my family won each of them. So, little bit of pride going on there.
You survived.
Yeah, well, obviously they survived, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. No, all my ancestors died at the Battle of Culloden. Oh dear. So yeah, it started as a hobby when I was 4, grew into a passion, then grew into a profession. Christian Slot Hulk asks, how would World War II go differently if the Royal Navy had been allowed to build 2 G3 class battle cruisers, their 16-inch gun ships? Well, you probably would have had at least one of them hovering around waiting for Bismarck to come out, so it probably would have been a G3 instead of Hood, which would have been rather interesting. I mean, if you've got 5 battle cruisers, it does change quite a few things, and I mean, both G3s are probably going to be in a fast reaction force, and then Renown, Repulse and Hood are probably going to be released a lot sooner to be things like convoy escorts if you've got something as big and powerful as the G3s to run around with. Hood I can actually see being detached to Force H, so if the 2 G3s are up with the home fleet, then Hood is in Force H instead of Renown. Renown and Repulse might very well go to the Mediterranean fleet at the other end, help scare the Italians for a while. It probably means more fast capital ships in the Mediterranean much earlier, and a lot harder fight for the Germans. Gogs 1973 says Culloden was not a Scottish-English battle. No, it was a Scottish lowlander in English battle against Scottish Highlanders, but with occasional help from the French. But as far as me and Mrs. Drack's ancestors were concerned, it was one side versus the other. Jake Miller asks, Drack versus Mrs. Drack, who would win? Yeah, Mrs. Drack says me, so yeah, there you go. I mean, I am the one who does medieval reenactment and HEMA twice a week, so... Hendog 1000. You can bring one design from any point in history forward 10 years from its original construction date. Which one do you choose to have the most impact on history? I mean, I presume you mean 10 years further back in time. So if it's, say, in 1860, it's actually now in 1850. I mean, it's difficult to argue with Dreadnought. I mean, Dreadnought was enough of a shock at the time, even though navies were gradually trending towards something like that. But if you have Dreadnought in 1896 instead of 1906, I mean, you've barely got the pre-Dreadnought age going at that point. and suddenly you have, instead of just transiting out of compound into Harvey Army, you've now got a ship with at that point you've now got a vessel that's armed with, well, it's armed with all the guns. It's got turbine engines. It's got Krupp armor. I suppose you might have a similar effect if you brought something like, say, Queen Elizabeth back to 1903, just before the Russia-Japanese war kicks off and everybody's running around with pre-dreadnoughts, and then you suddenly pop up with Queen Elizabeth. That might scare a lot of people as well. The problem is, if you go further back, what you're going to do, bring an Age of Sail design forward 10 years, that's not really going to impress people that much. I suppose you could bring Gloire or Warrior back to 1850, but people kind of already knew that was possible. I think it's just the step change of something like a Dreadnought or Queen Elizabeth going back 10 years that will probably be the scariest thing. Redneck Fury asks, does any theoretical advantage exist to a split secondary battery? There are two theoretical advantages. One is that you can engage surface and air targets separately at the same time. Although, in theory, with the dual-purpose battery, you could do that as well. You just split individual turrets. The other theoretical advantage is that each gun is more specialised to its particular role. So, if you've got your split battery, in theory, your anti-surface guns should have slightly heavier shells than dual-purpose weapons, and slightly longer range, which means they'll be a bit better at stopping enemy destroyers, and your anti-aircraft guns will probably be slightly smaller, slightly faster firing, slightly faster traversing than a dual-purpose weapon, which would mean they're slightly better at being anti-aircraft guns. But that's really the only two advantages to a theoretical split secondary battery. Similian says, bring the Type 21 U-boat forward by 10 years. Might work, but to be honest, given the problems they had making the Type 21 work in 1945, in 1935 all you've given the Germans is a very weird technical puzzle. Brian Redeman, were there any warships that sank because of plumbing problems besides certain German submarines? Well, other nations' submarines occasionally had that kind of problem. But no, it depends how far you go with plumbing. If plumbing is purely to do with toilets, no. If plumbing's to do with, pipe work and valves failing, then yes, there were a few warships through time that either came very close to sinking or outright sank because of various pipes and valves within the ship carrying fairly significant amounts of water jamming open or rupturing. John Driscoll, the Confederate States purchased armour and engines for their domestically produced ships. Purchases armour and engines for the domestically produced ships. I guess this is an alternate history. Is the Confederate States more successful at breaking portions of the blockade, and do they hold the breaches in the blockade? If they purchase armour and engines for the domestically produced ships, well, they didn't. They had some resource shortages, but they weren't exactly completely crippled when it came to making armour and engines for their ironclads anyway. It wasn't so much that they couldn't find armour and engines, period. It was more the fact of they didn't have the shipyards to produce the bigger, more advanced ships at all, which is why they were trying to contract ironclads from overseas yards. So I don't think it's going to help them all that much. And apart from anything else, if they're buying armour and engines, you've got to get them there somehow. Which means going through the blockade with the material that you need to break the blockade, which means it's not been broken, which means you've just basically given the Union a bunch of freshly made, presumably British or French armour plate and engines, which I'm sure they'd be very grateful for. So just copying down a couple more of the super chats. Right. Jimmy Lee asks, if the Royal Navy managed to get nuclear shells, who would push for shelling German ports and who would lead the attack? Depends what war you're talking about. If it's World War One, Fisher would be all in for shelling German ports with nuclear shells, and he'd probably personally lead the attack as well. If it's World War Two, well, getting in a position to shell the German ports might be a bit more of a tall order. It's a bit difficult to work out who'd push for actually shelling the German ports with nuclear shells at that point. In World War Two. I think in World War Two, if they had nuclear shells, they'd probably just rig them up to drop them out of a bomber and hit an inland city. Because even right towards the end of the war, getting ships into close range bombardment distance of a German port was still quite dangerous. Catch Bay asks, did the Germans have an advantage in fighting against ships that they built? So, for example, fighting Type 42s in the Falklands. Over time, the British have fought against a number of ships that they've built. I mean, they were fighting against a couple of their own ships that had been captured at Trafalgar. I suppose, well, back in the age of sail, it was much of a muchness, so not really a particular advantage or disadvantage. By the time you get to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, if they're fighting against ships that they have themselves built, I suppose you know exactly what their capabilities are, although you don't know how the crews are handling them. So you'd have a slight advantage, but not a tremendous amount of one. I suspect most of the advantage when you're fighting against a ship that you've actually built as opposed to just fighting any other generic ship probably comes more and more in the realms of once electronic systems start to really kick in, which comes in past the period when this channel covers. Hendog 1000, you mentioned Operation Vegetarian in a previous dry dock. I went and did some research, and I must say that was a particularly nasty operation they had planned. Yes, it was. Yeah, Operation Vegetarian probably would have had a higher body count than multiple nukes, which is saying something. And it wouldn't have been as pleasant a death either, which is also saying something. Whiskey Delta Golf, what are the largest types of ships that could reasonably be expected to fight a 1v1 engagement in the era the channel covers? Well, I mean, almost anything could fight a 1v1. You can come up with plausible reasons about why even a battleship might fight another single battleship. I mean, Rodney almost 1v1 Gneisenau during Operation Berlin. So anything's possible, but I think if you're looking at most reasonably, probably cruisers. I would say probably cruisers, because there's a few like Berwick versus Hipper, for example, where there are single cruiser on cruiser engagements, because cruisers are common enough to be quite widely spread, but also, whilst they're still very valuable, you do quite often see cruisers either operating with minimal or no support alone. So the idea of two cruisers in World War II running into each other is not entirely out of the question, I would say. In World War One, yeah, actually, again, Sydney versus Emden, I would say a cruiser would be the biggest ship that you could say, yeah, reasonably, it's quite reasonable to expect a 1v1 going on here. Joseph Nielsen asks, World War II Germany with US fleet subs, better or worse? I'd say probably a bit of a mixed bag. Out in the mid-Atlantic, and when the Germans go after the shipping on the west coast, on the east coast of America, they do better. But then in the slightly closer, more violent environments of the North Sea and western approaches, where there's a lot more Allied escorts and aircraft available earlier, possibly slightly worse, because Type 7s, which obviously some of the more common U-boats, are being smaller, are a little bit harder to detect, a little bit quicker to dive, etc., etc. So yeah, kind of a mixed bag. It would depend where they decide to deploy them. XX Breaking Wind XX asks, if using Rozhesvensky's tiers, Kamchatka is placed in command of magically kept Japanese torpedoes during Tsushima, how does it go? Probably, to be honest, actually, it probably, much as I appreciate the humour in the question, it probably actually doesn't change that much realistically, because by the time the Japanese had worked their way down to where Kamchatka was, the battle was pretty much decided, and that part of the Russian line was mostly being worked over by cruisers, who are probably the best place to deal with small random torpedo boats. Colin Cameron asked, did I miss my question about the reaction of US Italians to a UK German World War I victory? It would appear that I have somehow managed to miss that question. I do apologise. If you could drop me an email or Discord message about it, then that would be most appreciated. And I will try and address it as soon as I can. Just 4 more super chats to go. Thomas Hobarth, which ship gave the bigger fight before going down? Bismarck, Scharnhorst, or Yamato? Yamato. I mean, it's not necessarily surprising because of the sheer size of the ship, but also it took a while to put it down. Scharnhorst, the fight lasted quite a while, but Scharnhorst was doing a lot of running. So it wasn't so much necessarily a fight so much as it was trying to get people to go away from it while it ran away to safety. Yamato took quite a while to go down and absorbed an awful lot of ordnance. One thing I always point out, which really annoys people who get slightly overly attached to Bismarck, is that Bismarck sank faster than Kirishima. So yeah, for all that people like to go on and on and on about the legendary toughness of Bismarck, in actual straight up combat from the moment the first major shell is fired against her in her last action to the time she slips under, Bismarck's actually one of the fastest sinking ships in any battleship versus battleship fight that didn't involve something suddenly exploding. Godfrey, Protector of the Holy Sepulchre, asks, which of the major naval powers of the Second World War was the least prepared for war in terms of doctrine and command, as opposed to not numbers or firepower? I mean, the easy answer is the Soviet Union, because half their officers were dead or in Gulag. But I'm not necessarily sure about if they count as a major naval power. I mean, the Italians were fairly ready for the war they wanted to fight. The British had been preparing to fight any two of the three powers they ended up fighting. The Americans and the Japanese have been refining their doctrine for quite a while by being actually at war with China. I would say it would probably be a split between the French and the Americans. Basically, with the French, it would be kind of tied to numbers and firepower, but not strictly, but mainly because the French had a big plan for modernising their fleet that they were only part way through, so you can't fully formulate a doctrine and command strategy for your navy when you've only got 40% of the navy you actually want, because they wanted to have carriers, they were building the Joffre class, they wanted to have multiple battleships, that's why Gascogne and Clemenceau were on the stocks. They wanted more cruisers, they wanted more destroyers. They only had a fraction of the fleet they actually wanted for a modern naval fight, and they were then thrust into a war where they were having to kind of quickly try and pick up the pieces of that. The only reason I would say the Americans are the other ones in the running is not because necessarily the stuff that they ended up using was bad, but purely because with the amount of destruction that was leveled at Pearl Harbor, their previous doctrine had envisaged the heavy use of battleships, and suddenly they didn't have much, if any, battleships, and even fewer fleet oilers to support them available. So they were forced to do a very sudden pivot from a mixed, almost combined arms naval approach to an almost carrier-centric or carrier-only naval approach, which meant having to take what they had thought about was being their carrier doctrine in the interwar period and suddenly massively amp up its importance. Catchbay saying, I also use your videos to sleep. And Jimmy Lee asks, how long can Drac survive if Mrs. Drac uses siege tactics and no house chores for Drac? How much war reparations can Mrs. Drac claim if Drac surrenders? I don't even want to know. There's so many weapons in this house, any kind of internal siege is just going to end in a bloodbath. Right. Okay, so that's all the super chats, that's all the Patreon questions that I'm aware of. My voice is almost going, I'm out of Iron Brew. I'm very tired. It's 22:52. I will try and get a few of your questions done, but obviously, as I hope you can understand, I am a little bit on the end of my tether. Mrs. Drac, if you're not too busy, can I trouble you for a drink so that I don't just die of thirst right now?
I suppose.
Thank you. Anuk saying, are you okay? Do you look a bit under the weather? I'm okay. I'm just very tired. I drove up to... Oh, yes. Yeah. Check it. I drove up to Liverpool on Thursday, which was a 4-hour drive. And then I drove back from Liverpool yesterday, which turned into a 6.5-hour drive because everybody decided they wanted to look at the mysterious number of accidents and breakdowns that had occurred. Frank Spazzato, your duck versus the fluffy torpedo. There is a fluffy torpedo somewhere over there. I think Duckinifel wins, though. HMS King George V, how did the Canarius class compare to the rest of the counties? They're a bit of an odd one, aren't they? They look a bit weird. They're somewhat customised. Or the other thing is it's also which counties, because the counties were built in a series of subclasses to start with, and then you've also got to consider are you looking at sort of an original flavour county, one of the first to be produced in its as produced state, or by the time the Canarius class is coming into service, the many and varied wonderful refits and modernisations that counties have had, because a Canarius versus HMS London. HMS London is heavily modified and modernised, but it's also not particularly successful. Whereas if you put her up against Norfolk or Suffolk, well, their upgrades were considerably more successful, if slightly less extensive. So by the time the Canariuses are in service, what counts as a county and how good it is kind of is literally completely all over the shop. Thank you very much. Oh, that's nice and cold. Sorry my voice is getting quicker than normal, but I have literally been sitting here all day recording the last bits of the recorded version of the Patreon Drydock. So instead of talking to you guys for coming up to 3 hours after a relatively quiet day, I have been talking pretty much non-stop since about 11 o'clock this morning. Ghost Phantom 000 asks, what if the UK had gotten second Admiral instead of the Nelson somehow? Admiral class, that is. Is the UK better or worse off? Worse off because they now only have 2 what are roughly classified as post-Jutland ships instead of 3. And, ships can only be in one place at one time, so 2 ships instead of 3, even if those 2 are a little bit, even if one of them is a bit faster than the 2 historical ones, it's not good. Knight6831 says, did HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns punching through Bismarck's armoured conning tower prove that it wasn't as safe as people thought? It proved you shouldn't get hit by a 16-inch shell at close range. I actually think, apart from anything, if you look at Rodney's 16-inch gun performance at its action with Bismarck, if there's any one major lesson to be drawn away from that is that Rodney's 16-inch guns are actually, by all accounts, seem to be considerably more powerful than their on-paper stats give them credit for. Because you've also got a slightly longer range, one of the shells blowing straight through the front plate of one of I think it's Bruno turret, blowing straight through it and hitting the backplate hard enough to blow the backplate out. Now, if you look at any armour penetration table and compare the German thickness of armour plate on a Bismarck's turret front with the penetration of Rodney's 16-inch shells ostensibly at that range, that should never have happened, but it did. Which suggests to me that, at least at those kind of ranges, the armour penetration figures for Rodney's guns are somewhat more conservative. Eric Amborski asks, in your video on if Task Force 34 was at Samar, what if the American force is unchanged but Haruna was sunk instead of Musashi? It does become a much closer fight, because you've now basically got 2 Iowas dueling it out with 2 Yamatos in daylight, which technically the Yamatos have a slight advantage over them. I'd say the margin of power, the balance of power is still probably just with the Americans, because the other American battleships should be able to finish off Kongo and Nagato quicker than the Yamato should be able to kill the Iowas. I mean, the thing is, when you've got Iowas and Yamatos slugging it out in broad daylight, there could be some fairly dramatic happenings very quickly, which may render all of that moot. But again, at least if you're going just on the paper side of things, then in theory there should be still a slight advantage to the US, because even if one or both of the Iowas are slightly getting beaten into submission, 1, the Yamatos won't be looking too healthy either, and then 2, in theory you should have at least 1 and then possibly 2 US battleships coming in to help, which then tips the scales quite firmly in the Americans' favour. USS Grey but Ghost, who would win, the entire Japanese carrier force from the entire length of World War II but no escorts, but with full flight groups, or all of the Fletchers built in World War II? Considering how many hundreds of Fletchers were built, the Fletchers would be the winners, because they could just stick together, blanket the skies and charge. Jimmy Lee asks, is there any way to see Drac in sailor uniforms from 1500 to 1945? Technically, I suppose, yes. That would involve a lot of investment on my part, though, because I'd have to get quite a few. And also, Do you mean regular sailors or officers? Because obviously officers' uniforms are going to cost even more. They're not the kind of thing you can easily hire. You can't just wander into a shop and say, yes, I would like naval uniform circa 1750. I mean, the Royal Navy uniform went through enough different variations, especially from the officer side of things. Sailor stuff might be slightly easier to do, but even then you're still looking at least half a dozen just to capture the major changes. Because I'm Batman 5702 asks, did Armchair Admirals get cancelled or postponed? It's currently postponed. I think for fairly obvious reasons. There's no point trying to fight a tidal wave of angry ranting comments, especially when that would have been on Monday. This coming Monday on the 28th is when it should have been, but yeah, let's just not go there. I'm not talking about current events. Jacob Moss asks, the War of the Worlds Martians arrive in 1878 in the dystopian wars world. How quickly are the Martian fighting machines destroyed, and can all the tripods make a dent in any of the powers' militaries? Well, they technically kind of exist in the dystopian wars world in the form of the Invaders, which were a relatively rare set of models for people to buy, and they are literally the War of the Worlds Martians showing up. I actually have a set I haven't painted yet. They're quite fun. They are a bit OP, but obviously they've been scaled to the dystopian wars world. If you're talking about strictly H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds Martians, then they'd be destroyed pretty quick, because the dystopian wars world would either show up with some kind of land dreadnought, masses of tanks, aircraft, and I mean, given that it's Britain, you'd either have war rotors showing up the instant the tripods start pulling themselves out of their cases, or the mobile oppression palace would just step on them. And for those of you who aren't aware, look up Dystopian Wars Windsor class mobile fortification when I refer to the mobile oppression palace. Right. Ryan Ferrier says, what would you say were the most underrated battleship, destroyer and cruiser classes of World War II? Ooh, that's a good one. Underrated. Underrated, personally, I think the most underrated is the Littorios. They get a lot of completely unfair stick simply for being Italian, and a little bit of unfair stick for supposedly having constantly malfunctioning shells, which isn't actually the case. Sometimes they kind of worked, sometimes they were just a bit unlucky. So the Littorios would be my choice for underrated battleship. Underrated destroyer. I'd say probably something like maybe a J class. Again, mostly because you don't hear about them. People kind of, they know the standard 4-gun Royal Navy destroyers of the interwar period. They know the tribals, they know the war emergency flotillas. But quite often people don't really seem to clock that there was an intervening set, the JKs, Ls, Ms and Ns, which were actually sort of 6-gun twin turret destroyers with decent torpedo armament, etc. Very much like a immediate pre-war version of the Gearings in many ways, except for the fact that their dual 4.7s weren't quite as good at being dual purpose as the Gearing's twin 5-inch 38s were. Yeah. I'm not sure about cruisers though. A lot of the cruisers that deserve credit get the credit. A lot of cruisers classes that don't deserve credit don't. Underrated cruisers. It's quite a difficult one actually. I'm not sure with the underrated cruisers bit. At least not at the moment, with my brain beginning to shut down. Okay, it's 23:05. what am I going to do? Because I'm really beginning to struggle. Okay, I'm going to do... I'm going to go till 10 past 11 roughly. And then I'm really going to have to put myself to bed before I collapse. I'll just drift gradually off the screen and that'll be the last you see me. Ricardo Andre, USS Midway in 1935 or so, how would that impact carrier development? See, the thing about moving something like Midway back to 1935, yes, it would be impressive, but the Lexingtons exist. So the idea of a massive fleet carrier isn't going to be as shocking. It's still a straight deck carrier, it's just a big one. So they'll be like, oh, yeah, we can build them slightly bigger than the Lexingtons. We kind of knew that. It's useful. It's very useful, but it's not... It's not the level of impact that some other things being moved back 10 years would be. Thor's axe. In World War II, what was the difference between a destroyer and a destroyer escort, and could the destroyer do a job of an escort? Yes, a destroyer could do the job of an escort. A destroyer escort was usually a little bit smaller than a contemporary destroyer. It wasn't as heavily armed. It would either have fewer main guns or smaller main guns, or possibly both. The destroyer escort was much more configured for anti-sub warfare. Many destroyer escorts would be slower than fleet destroyers, but as I say, they became more depth charges and the like. And usually they were a little bit more agile as well. So the destroyer could do a destroyer escort's job, certainly, and often they did. A destroyer escort, though, some might struggle at times with a destroyer's job, because if they came up against a full-fat enemy fleet destroyer, they might not have the firepower to stand off against them, and they wouldn't have the speed necessarily to get away. D King asks, what wargame do you use to wargame your scenarios, or which historical wargame would you suggest? So, I've said before, I use a modified version of General Quarters 1 or General Quarters 2, depending on which time period you're wargaming out. There is a General Quarters 3 now, which apparently is a bit better. So, personally, I would suggest that, but that is very much for my specific needs of trying to get a decent simulation wargame going. It depends what you would want to be wargaming out. Because I mean, if you want a fast, fun wargame scenario that's perhaps a little bit more abstract, then you could use something like Victory at Sea by Warlord Games. Ramal asks, did the US Navy refine their destroyer tactics, particularly in night fighting in 43-44, like in the Battle of Kula Gulf or Cape St. George? And does Commander Arleigh Burke have a factor in this? Yes. Yeah, the US Navy was on a very severe learning curve in 42-43, to be honest, and Burke was definitely a big part of that. Burke introduced both a combination of discipline and aggressiveness into US formations, which was definitely needed, because you could find plenty of aggressive US commanders and plenty of US formations, US forces that could keep good formation and work together, but the combination was rare. I'd say by 44 the US had a pretty good handle on what they were doing when it came to destroyer night actions. It was more 42, especially Guadalcanal, was a huge trial by fire, and then the immediate aftermath of that and into early 43 was when they were trying to take the lessons they'd been given and learn what they actually meant. Jimmy Lee asks, which warship of the period would Drac and Mrs. Drac have been in if they were part of the Great Voyage of the Great White Fleet, or some kind of older ancient ship? I think if we were given the opportunity to travel back in time and be on the voyage of any particularly massive ships of any description, actually I think I'd want to go on an Inca ship, mainly because no one knows what the heck they were, particularly. We have very, very scattered information about what the Inca had in terms of ocean-going trade and transport, other than we know they had some. And we know that Tupa Inca, who was kind of the Inca version of Alexander the Great, sent a massive fleet of ships out west into the Pacific. Not entirely sure what happened to them. Again, the records just kind of say they went off and either don't pick up on what happened to them when they came back or if they came back. But I'd be very interested to see what the heck they actually were. Right, so I'm going to do 2 more questions and then we will call it a night. Frank Spazartis asks, what range was Rodney from Bismarck when she hit? Depends which hit. Her earliest hits were, well, there's a big debate. Well, not so much of a big debate. I think the majority opinion is that Rodney is the one that totals Bismarck's primary fire control, communications cables, and command crew, with her first hit, which is quite long distance against which I think, if I remember correctly, is supposed to hit the conning tower, and the splash and debris is what kills the primary fire control. And then there's arguments that are made. It might have been King George V, it might have been Dorsetshire, who knows, but anyway. And then basically for the rest of the battle, Rodney is closing until she just starts circling at very, very point blank range. So it depends which hit you're looking at. So is it the hit that Rodney scores potentially that cripples Bismarck's command and control? Is it the hit that punches through Bruno turret? Is it the hit that wipes out the forward secondary fire control, and so on and so forth? They all happen at very different ranges. Ramal asks, I saw your US tour schedule. Are you going to do a 2-day tour on USS New Jersey? And if yes, are you going to do a detailed tour on USS New Jersey? Well, I'm planning 2 days at USS New Jersey, which will give me time to explore the ship in detail, meet and chat with Ryan, obviously do plenty of filming, a couple of other things we've got planned for the ship, and obviously meet a bunch of you guys, which will be quite fun. So it's going to be all over the place. But yeah, New Jersey is the single longest period I'm staying on at a particular vessel, so that'll be interesting, I believe. Especially actually means that Philadelphia is the city we'll be spending the longest time in, looking at ships, because we'll also obviously be there the day before to look at USS Olympia. So it's Olympia, New Jersey, that's 3 days. Yeah, because we're going to be in LA for 3 days, but on the 3rd day we're kind of be moving towards San Diego, so yeah, it's all a bit up in the air. Right. Oh, I've got a bit. Okay, one more question. Where am I going to choose one more question from? Okay. Ken Krakow, the last question is going to be, have you visited USS Texas? No, I haven't. Not yet. I won't be visiting her during this trip because they are prepping the ship for movement. So it's covered in a lot of people in hard hats and high-vis, and the last thing I want to do is get annoyingly underfoot while they're desperately trying to get the ship ready for probably the single biggest day of its existence for quite a while. As some of you may or may not know, I am actually going to be in Canada at the beginning of June, which in theory, everything going well, will be shortly after Texas is actually in her dry dock, hopefully by then. So if the Drydock officials are happy with it, I hopefully will then be able to visit her in Drydock once she's nice and safely secured, which will also afford a rather excellent opportunity that's even better than seeing her in the water, which is seeing her out of the water, so you can go down and around it, which will be quite interesting. So, yeah, sorry guys if I didn't get to your questions. I know this is a slightly shorter live than normal, but I am really reaching the end of my tether, and hopefully I will, well, I'll see some of you guys on the next live, whenever that is, and I might even see some of you guys in real life at some point, maybe in the US. So, thanks very much everyone. Thank you for understanding. I'm going to bed.